But I think where ketones shine is using exogenous ketones as a means to preserve performance, resilience in extreme environments. There's so many different factors that need to come into play when you're choosing to do a ketogenic diet, including monitoring. People really need to track nutrients, track calories. Some people they eat a ketogenic diet, but they put the same amount of food on the plate, and the caloric density of the ketogenic diet is like 50% higher. So you can't eat. So typically, we have auto-feedback mechanisms that will tell us when we're satiated and full, but for some people, they don't work well. So they do need to count calories and macronutrients and track, at least initially, so they have some idea of how many calories they're eating.
Hey everyone, I'm sitting here with Dr. Dom D'Agostino, who is an associate professor at the University of South Florida. He's also a research scientist at the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. His research lab focuses on metabolic therapies, including ketogenic diets, ketone supplements, among others. I'm super excited to have you back on the podcast, Dom. It's been 6.5 years or so. It's been quite some time since we had a conversation. And since then, keto, or as it's called for sure in the popular world, has really, it's exploded in popularity. And I feel like with that explosion in popularity, it's lost a little bit of, it's become a little bit more of a brand and in the popular mind and less of a distinct metabolic state. And so I'm excited to have you here to talk about the science, to give us a refresher about the science of ketogenesis, ketosis, ketogenic diets, ketone supplements, and all those things. And as someone that has been researching it over the years, who's been practicing ketogenic diets personally for also many years, maybe we can kind of just start with a refresher what ketogenesis is.
Yeah, I think that gets lost in all the noise because it has been commoditized, so to speak, and commercialized in ways that are not always very good. So a ketogenic diet is unique from a dietary therapy point of view in that it's the only diet that we know of that is defined by an objective biomarker. So that's ketones, and you measure that in your blood, in your urine, and also in your breath, right? So there's different ways to do that. If you are not in a state of hyperketonemia, elevated ketones, you're technically not on a ketogenic diet. And what most people don't really appreciate is that to really get higher levels of ketones that are therapeutically linked to what it's used to treat, which is like neurological disorders, seizures, and things like that, you really have to increase the fat, drop the carbohydrates especially, but moderate the protein and really consume a really high fat diet. And that's not always sort of appreciated in the mainstream. And a clinical diet is probably not the best choice for a lot of people, a clinical ketogenic diet. But there are variations of the diet from a 4-to-1, which is a classical ketogenic diet, which is 90% fat and 1 part protein and carbohydrates. And then all the way on the other end of the spectrum, there's the modified ketogenic diet or modified Atkins or low glycemic index therapy or LGIT. And that's more of a 1-to-1 ketogenic diet is personally kind of what I follow. And I think you can construct the diet in a way that produces a mild state of ketosis. I think that could be a good lifestyle diet. But it's far different than the classical ketogenic diet, which was used for pediatric epilepsy. But they both have therapeutic effects that we can delve into.
Can you give us an example of that type of diet and also what is defined as being in either mild ketosis to actually, basically identify you as being in a state of ketosis from a ketogenic diet, or even from other, we can talk about other ways. Obviously, we've had a lot of people on the podcast talking about fasting.
So a ketogenic diet produces ketosis by suppressing insulin, right? And I think of it as almost like insulin suppression therapy. So when you fast, you suppress the hormone insulin, you deplete liver glycogen, and then that accelerates beta oxidation of fatty acids. And it's the oxidation of fatty acids in the liver, or the over oxidation of fatty acids, that accelerates production of acetyl-CoA. And then that condenses to acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate. So that's accelerated at a maximal state with fasting. And you can mimic that state of fasting with a classical ketogenic diet, which is like 90 to 80% fat, with a level of carbohydrate that almost has no effect on insulin, really. So you maintain, so in many ways it mimics fasting in that you have a low insulin, low IGF-1, a little bit suppression of mTOR because protein is moderated too. And then that diet is used classically for epilepsy. And then that's the 4-to-1 ketogenic diet. In extreme cases, they use a 5-to-1 ketogenic diet. And then if you move down the spectrum, it's 3-to-1, 2-to-1, and then modified Atkins, which is like a 1.5-to-1 ketogenic diet, to a low glycemic index diet. So what that would mean as far as, to give an example for me, so yesterday I counted my macros and I had 200 grams of protein, 150 grams of fat, and 50 grams of carbohydrates. So 200 grams of protein compared to a combination of 150 grams of fat and 50 grams, or 150 grams of protein, sorry, and 50 grams of carbohydrates. So that would be a 1-to-1. So I have 200 grams of fat, 150 grams of protein, and 50 grams of carbs, right? So it's 200 grams and 200 grams. So that's how it's constructed in the world of epilepsy or dietary therapies, by grams, not percentages. So that's a 1-to-1 ketogenic diet, and that sounds extremely high in fat, right? 200 grams of fat and 150 grams of protein. But that's actually the very liberal, more loose version of the ketogenic diet that produces a very mild state of elevated ketones. Whereas a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet would be like 400 grams of fat to 90 grams of protein and 10 grams of carbohydrates, right? So that would be very high in fat. So they both, interestingly, the research over the years have shown that they both have anti-seizure effects, and we're getting a better appreciation for a more liberal version of the ketogenic diet that is not so protein restricted and not so extremely carbohydrate restricted than something like a low glycemic index diet, which can produce little or no ketones. It can still have an anti-seizure effect and still have benefits, even independent of high ketones. So that's kind of interesting to me because it was always thought of that you needed to get really high ketones to achieve a therapeutic effect. But it looks like you could probably get many benefits from low ketones, but you're also suppressing insulin and suppressing a lot of other pathways that are, therapeutic in some way. They're altering, I should say, different pathways. I don't know if I answered your question, I'm just trying to, there's variations of the ketogenic diet. And I think that over the last 10 years, I guess it's longer than that. I think in 2008, Dr. Eric Kossoff from Johns Hopkins, he worked with Dr. John Freeman, the late John Freeman, and developed a modified Atkins diet or modified ketogenic diet for adult epilepsy. And then it was published that the diet can work for adults too, back in 2007 or 8, I think around that time. So we have many variations of the ketogenic diet, even used clinically. And then when people talk about the ketogenic diet in the mainstream, that could be anything. I mean, typically it means carbohydrate, restriction, and it could be a carnivore diet. It could be, and we can talk about that. And there are many different variations, but clinically what you have is a 5-to-1, which is very extreme high fat, 4-to-1, 3-to-1, 2-to-1, and then a modified ketogenic diet or low glycemic index diet. And all of them are therapeutic in one way or another, and they're used for a variety of different neurological disorders, seizure disorders, metabolic disorders. But some are more efficacious for others. It depends on the individual. It depends on compliance, on the family. There's a lot to be considered when it comes to implementing these approaches.
For a person who has not done a ketogenic diet before, what would be a good starting point? Like, would you want to start with something that's one of the more like 4 or 5-to-1? Because from my own personal experience, and I've I'm going to be doing another ketogenic diet very soon. I just haven't gotten my biomarkers measured.
Yeah.
But it was very challenging for me, even someone that does a lot of intermittent fasting, to really to get into ketosis and to really stay in, and also what levels, like if someone's measuring, and we can talk about biomarkers and measuring things, but like what would be considered a mild state of ketosis if you're wanting to go by ketone levels, for example.
So very good question. It's very context dependent. So if you are using the ketogenic diet to manage a metabolically linked disorder or a brain disorder like epilepsy, right? You probably want to start with a clinical ketogenic diet and be under the supervision of a registered dietitian and a neurological team. So this is what they use in epilepsy. And there used to be an induction phase where they would fast you, and that actually helps facilitate metabolic switching, which is the transition into ketosis from being primarily a glucose oxidizer to a fat and ketone utilizer. So you can speed that with fasting. But then you have, most people are doing it, as a lifestyle approach. So in our clinical trial that we're doing using in non-diabetic people, they tend to be a little bit on the heavier side, maybe, but they don't have type 2 diabetes. They're using it to optimize their metabolic parameters and glycemic variability. We transition them into a ketogenic diet over 4 to 6 weeks. So we titrate the carbohydrates down. And what we have found, or my colleague has found, Dr. Allison Hull, who's she's at the Florida Medical Clinic and has a wellness program, that compliance and adherence to the diet and ultimately the results are better if you take someone who's eating 200-300 grams of carbohydrates a day, that's standard, American diet, and you drop them down to, 100 and then the 75 and then 50 at about the 4 to 6 week point. And you get a very nice improvement in many different subjective and objective, biomarkers. They feel better, signs of mood are increased, anxiety using the GAD-7 test, the PHQ-9, SSQ, sleep actually improves. If you were to abruptly start the ketogenic diet, you're more likely to get side effects, and you're more likely to get things like sleep disruption, lipid abnormalities, elevated triglycerides. You get a quick spike in LDL. This can occur if you rapidly start the ketogenic diet, especially in the context of not calorie restricting. When you calorie restrict a ketogenic diet, it sort of mitigates many of the things that are negatively associated with high-fat diets. So the transition's a lot easier if you calorie restrict with a ketogenic diet. So that needs to be appreciated. But if for a lifestyle, I would recommend, if you're not on a carbohydrate restricted diet, to ease into it and titrate it in over time if you're not in a rush, right? So for me personally, I follow what would be considered a very modified, supplemented ketogenic diet that would be more along the lines of a low glycemic index diet. So I have about, 10 to some days, 20% of my diet is actually carbohydrates, but in the form of fibrous vegetables, right? So essentially non-glycemic carbohydrates. So a lot of leafy greens, a lot of the carbohydrates that make up my ketogenic diet are typically have about 1/3 to almost half of it is fiber, and has very little impact, or actually can improve glycemic variability or reduce it, in that it moderates the digestion of protein and helps delay gastric absorption, so the nutrients and things that I'm eating actually get into circulation in a protracted way. So the fiber helps to slow digestion. And so fat and fiber together are really important for the ketogenic diet, and that's not something classically that's accepted or considered, but as we learn more about ketogenic diets, we have an appreciation for the types of fats that are in the diet, and actually incorporating fiber not only to improve digestion and protein assimilation, but to enhance and preserve the gut microbiome, which is to be appreciated. So there was a lack of that understanding 20 or 30 years ago, and it came into the conversation about 10 years ago. And now it's actually become a major focus of a lot of these dietary interventions, low-carb and ketogenic diets. We need to appreciate fiber as a part of improving the diversity and maintaining the gut microbiome.
You've just answered one of the main questions I had about being on a modified ketogenic diet and somehow intelligently designing a diet that had include more fiber and your thoughts on how fiber would be important. And it's really interesting to hear you say that because the other thing is that fiber, you are making butyrate in the gut when your bacteria is making it the microbiome inside your gut, and that is fueling the colonocytes, right, giving them energy. Is it like for me, when I was doing the ketogenic diet, I did find that that I ended up just naturally fasting more because it's so difficult, like things I could eat. It was like, well, I can't I would snack on some macadamias, and after a certain point, it was like, well, this is like too much, the ratios of the protein and the, so I'd have to like not eat, and then I found that I was basically just doing a lot of dietary restriction alongside the ketogenic diet. But I also found that when I would add like dark leafy greens, the portions really made a difference for me. Like, for example, cooked spinach, like you don't think about it, but like, because you're cooking it, it's like a lot more spinach than you would think it is. And so like a little serving of it looks small, but it's actually quite a bit. And so I noticed if I had like a portion of cooked spinach, it wouldn't totally take me out of ketosis, but it wasn't getting me into that higher level. So, I would go from like 3 millimolar down to, 1. So,
So you were cooking your spinach, If you take raw leafy greens, so the cell wall's intact, but when you cook vegetables, green vegetables, the heat ruptures the cell wall, so you make the carbohydrates a little more accessible, even if it's green leafy vegetables. So that's going to impact, believe it or not, in the context of a ketogenic diet, it makes a difference. If you have greens that are raw, the glycemic impact is essentially nothing. But if you cook your greens and, it does make it proportionally much smaller, so you're more likely to eat more, but it also makes the carbohydrates accessible because the heat is rupturing the cell wall. So similar to like juicing or a smoothie or something like that, right? So although with a smoothie, you got the fiber and stuff in with it too. So that's a big consideration that people need to consider. So
Great tip.
But volume. But with a salad, like a salad an example of a salad on a modified ketogenic diet or modified Atkins diet would be, fatty fish like salmon, leafy greens like arugula, maybe some spinach and romaine lettuce and stuff, and extra virgin olive oil, lots of that. And I tend to mix it with MCT oil. So a combination of extra virgin MCT, we can get into that as a ketogenic fat, and some like nuts are great, but I don't go too crazy with nuts, but a little bit of walnuts. So you have fatty fish, a little bit of leafy greens, and a very fatty ketogenic dressing that's made, with MCT and olive oil and herbs and things like that would fit in well with a ketogenic diet. So you get monounsaturated fats, right? And you're getting polyunsaturated fats and MCTs, which are saturated, but go to they do not disrupt the gut microbiome in ways that other types of fatty acids do. And that's the kind of nutrition that would be no effect on a continuous glucose monitor, and so your glycemic response would be like nothing, and your ketones would likely go up because of the macronutrient ratio, but also because of the MCTs that are in it too. So that's a very normal kind of typical diet that I eat.
So most of your greens or most of your carbohydrates are eaten raw for the most part. Do you generally not cook them?
If I do, we do broccoli a lot and asparagus, so I lightly steam it or cook it, but I don't make it to the point where it's like mushy. So I lightly steam vegetables like cauliflower, broccoli, asparagus, and I always have a salad with my meal. And not with the ketogenic diet, when you wear a continuous glucose monitor, you can observe that the order in which you eat your food will impact the glycemic response. And if you're attenuating the glycemic response by eating foods in a certain order or a certain combination, that's also reducing the insulin. So you need to continually have a suppression of insulin and insulin signaling to maintain a state of ketosis. So if you're in a state of fasting ketosis or on a ketogenic diet and you inject a little bit of insulin, you'll see your ketones go down. There'll be a delayed response. That's because that reduction in insulin plays a big role. When you increase insulin, it dramatically increases glycolysis, translocation of the glut transporters to the membrane and things like that. So you could do that. Exogenous ketones can actually increase insulin if it's too much. And we can talk about the different variations of that and why that could be problematic in some conditions. But, taking a big hit of protein, like drinking whey protein, will kick you out of ketosis because you're going to get the insulin response from the essential amino acids, and branched chain amino acids too can increase that. So it's really important to incorporate fat and fiber with the meal, especially up front, to attenuate any kind of insulin response.
Right. Yeah. There's some interesting.
And you learn these things as you go. There's a learning curve to the ketogenic diet, and I went right into the classical ketogenic diet. I bought the book, the ketogenic diet for pediatric epilepsy, and now it's the ketogenic diet for epilepsy and other neurological disorders. Same author, Dr. Eric Kossoff, Dr. Mackenzie Cervenka from Johns Hopkins, and the team there. And they advocate for a variety of different types of ketogenic diets, and then adjusting it to the patient and their circumstances too is going to be important in the world of epilepsy. So it remains the only widely accepted application of the ketogenic diet at this time is really epilepsy and metabolic disorders like glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome, PDH deficiency, and things like that. And interestingly, there are inborn errors of metabolism that are contraindicated with a ketogenic diet, like carnitine transferase activity, CPT1, whether it be primary or secondary too. So it could be deadly. A ketogenic diet could potentially kill you if you have carnitine, transferase deficiency. So that's a whole nother topic we could discuss.
You bring up an interesting point with the contraindications because I'm interested in a few of those aspects. So for one, perhaps other genetic variants that maybe aren't as rare. So for example, ApoE4 allele, which, a quarter of the population has one of those alleles. Like how is it known how people with that polymorphism respond to ketogenic diets? And also you mentioned, briefly about people that sort of race into the ketogenic diet without any sort of carbohydrate restriction, and how it can elevate some biomarkers like triglycerides, for example. I'd love to talk about what biomarkers do you think are good to monitor and to see if someone is favorably or unfavorably responding to a ketogenic diet, and at what point would you, how many times would you do it before you sort of give up and sort of modify the diet or change the maybe types of fat? You mentioned the types of fat, or things like that.
Yeah, I think it's important. A lot of people jump into the ketogenic diet and, just from a standard diet, it's important to test the water. If you're not using it for epilepsy or another disorder, you want to titrate the carbohydrates down and track and monitor along the way. You maybe do cut your carbs in half or by 2/3 or whatever, and then at the 4 or 6 week mark, get blood work again and look at your glucose response, check for hypoglycemia, things like that. So ApoE4, that's about 1/4, right, of the population. I get this question a lot, and I don't think it's ideal. Even the books on ketogenic diets say that it's an unnatural diet and it's not healthy and it's not sustainable. So these are from the people who researched the ketogenic diet, who published the most on the ketogenic diet, who are in the trenches using this diet as a medical therapy for known conditions that are responsive to the ketogenic diet. So with that said, dietary teams that manage patients for up to 10 years, 20, and even I had some correspondence with a team that are measuring people and cardiovascular parameters too, their heart health for 30 years. So in patients, for example, with inborn errors of metabolism that need to be on a classical type ketogenic diet for 3 decades, and they're still doing all their blood work looks great. So I think that's a good example that the diet's not going to kill you. It would have done that a long time ago in these patients that are on a 4-to-1 or 3-to-1 ketogenic diet. But I think it's important to, in the context of ApoE4, a high fat, extremely high fat is probably not ideal. And so you want to take probably a more moderate approach and just restrict carbohydrates. I think it's really important to get lots of fiber, lots of phytonutrients. We know the data on fiber is just really, really good. So there's no arguing. People argue it against fiber, but I think the data for fiber is really good for not just for the microbiome, for the phytonutrients, the micronutrients. As you know, there's been a lack of appreciation for micronutrients and ketogenic diets, and that has caused problems like selenium deficiency, which led to cardiomyopathy. And there's case reports where people have literally, I think 1 or 2, where people have literally died from cardiomyopathy because of selenium deficiency associated with the ketogenic diet. So you want to make sure you supplement appropriately, but you don't have to supplement if you formulate the ketogenic diet appropriately with the right types of foods, but it's not always possible. But for ApoE, and getting back to your ApoE, so a diet that's moderate in fat, moderate in protein, and I think of carbohydrates as fiber. So plant-based fiber, moderate protein, and then fats. The types of fats are important. So monounsaturated fatty acids as opposed to long-chain saturated fats, medium-chain triglycerides are probably helpful. There is a study that was done using a product that is caprylic triglyceride, which is MCT. At the time, it was called AC1202 by Xera. It was a product that was designed for Alzheimer's disease as an alternative energy substrate that would be given. And the results of the study showed that improvements in mild cognitive impairment were associated with ketones. So there was a correlation with that. But they did not see the correlation in people with ApoE4, which is kind of interesting. Although I think a larger study probably would have shown a difference. But I think the take-home message is that a diet that's super restrictive and high in fat is probably not ideal for ApoE4 patients, and adding ketones in the form of exogenous ketones could probably be ideal. There was a case report on a patient that I'm familiar with, the wife of the patient that had passed away, but he was maintained on a ketogenic diet and then later on ketone esters and exogenous ketones, and did quite well on this diet for a long time. And it wasn't a restrictive ketogenic diet, but he did much better with ketone supplementation as a means to improve his cognition and different behavioral parameters too. So I think that would probably be the better way to go. I'm very cautious in speculating and giving medical advice. I'm not a medical doctor. I am a professor, and I'm professing that I think that a more moderate style Mediterranean-like low-carb / ketogenic diet with supplementation in the form of things like omega-3 fatty acids, MCT oils. The fatty acids comprising the diet should be more along the lines of monounsaturated fats and not so much heavy saturated fats, which in the context of ApoE4 is probably not a good thing to chronically maintain a state of ketosis with super high saturated fat.
Yeah, so maybe more avocados, more of the nuts and olive oil, salmon, which is a good type of polyunsaturated fatty acid. And I mean, that's the kind of diet that I was doing and will try again. And we'll talk a little bit more about why I'm so interested in ketogenic diets. I don't have epilepsy, and I'm certainly not someone that eats a standard American diet either. But there are so many interesting effects that being in a state of ketosis and having the ketone bodies elevated and that to me are very interesting and I think possibly beneficial for health span, for cognition, and so. But with the supplemented ketones that you keep mentioning, like with respect to having a diet you follow, which is more of the low glycemic index 1-to-1 ratio with supplemented ketones, it's another really big area that's exploded over the past few years. And can you talk a little bit about, for people that aren't familiar, like supplemental ketones? There's different types of supplemental ketones. You mentioned ketone esters, salts, and then even MCT, oils or powders. Yeah. So maybe we can kind of jump into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think the question is, like, why would you even want to short circuit the state? Why would you want to circumvent the dietary intervention that produces ketosis, i.e. the ketogenic diet? Why would you want to circumvent that? I mean, the reasons are kind of obvious, and just throw ketones into the mix. Like, what's going to happen physiologically? I think there are people who are unwilling or unable to do the ketogenic diet. So that was the motivation behind developing and testing and ultimately publishing a number of articles and studies on exogenous ketones. And there are different formulations, and not all types of exogenous ketones or formulations of combinations are applicable to different disorders, right? I think some conditions are more responsive to ketone esters, whereas some are more responsive to ketone salts or formulations of MCT and ketone salts, right? So when I first got into this research in 2008 or 9, I believe, I contacted a number of people who remain to be icons in this field. So Dr. Richard Veach, I like to always acknowledge him as being a pioneer in developing the rationale and developing ketone esters, and the rationale for using them, and writing a number of reviews that actually motivated me to pursue this path. Dr. Henri Brunengraber, George Cahill, Dr. Theodore Van Italy, I mean, they're all sort of friends and collaborators, and they published on this. So I was really focused on the ketogenic diet, but when you're writing a federal grant, and you're trying to sell this approach as a means to, reduce seizures or enhance warfighter performance, resilience, and things like that, the high-fat diet is still looked upon as something that is very negative. So the question was, can you develop a ketogenic diet in a pill? And essentially that was sort of the path we took with the ketone esters. And so the ketogenic diet, it was my understanding that the body at the time, that you need to have adaptations over time that would change your physiology, that would change your brain neuropharmacology, that would then have an anti-seizure effect. And that happens. There are physiological, by changing your system, your system's physiology, you're changing your brain neuropharmacology and your brain metabolism. So your brain is switching from using glucose and pretty much only glucose to using glucose and ketones. It never switches completely off of glucose and ketones. So the homeostatic mechanisms that maintain your blood glucose are very powerful. So your glucose pretty much stays normal, but insulin goes down. So that's a thing that we see. But the ketogenic diet, the effects of the ketogenic diet are, and sorry it's a long-winded version, but I want to kind of provide a framework. So it was, I was educated on the role of ketones as a metabolite, and also later as a signaling molecule, as a drug-like mediator of the ketogenic diet. So we produce these endogenous metabolites, and they not only serve as alternative energy for the brain and the heart and other tissues, but then they have signaling effects that mediate many of the beneficial effects associated with being in a state of therapeutic ketosis. So that's things like elevating adenosine, activating various ketone receptors, GPR109A receptor, for example, anti-inflammatory pathways, I was really interested in the oxidative stress associated with high pressure oxygen. So we measured like superoxide anion production using a lithium molecule like the fluorescence, and showed that mitochondrial ROS production goes down with beta hydroxybutyrate and ketone molecules. So there was all these things that were happening as a consequence of the hyperketonemia. So undoubtedly, there's things that happen with the ketogenic diet that are therapeutic and very beneficial that don't happen with exogenous ketones, but there's a lot of overlap. And then later, as we developed ketone esters and ketone salts and used MCTs, we saw that if we administer these things to animals that are not on a ketogenic diet, we saw remarkable anti-seizure effects, anti-cancer effects. We saw changing the brain neuropharmacology, meaning that the GABAergic tone went up. So GABA is made from glutamate via an enzyme called glutamic acid decarboxylase. So we have glutamate is the most ubiquitous neurotransmitter in the system, in our body, and we make, and that's an excitatory neurotransmitter that activates the AMPA receptors and NMDA receptors. And then glutamate, via the conversion to GABA through glutamic acid decarboxylase, is a brain stabilizing, calming neurotransmitter. And I've even measured my own neurotransmitters and showed that GABA is like twice as higher than what would be expected, my GABA to glutamate ratio, right? In animal models, we see this too. We did an animal model of Angelman syndrome, which is responsive to, we knew from case reports that the seizures could be silenced with the ketogenic diet. So we had an animal model of Angelman syndrome, and we administered ketone ester with a standard diet and saw an increase in GAD 65 and 67, and essentially an increase in GABA. And then that resulted in, well, we saw increase in learning and memory. We saw, anti-anxiety effects, and the increase in GABAergic tone likely contributes to the anti-seizure effect of that. And many anti-seizure drugs like vigabatrin and other drugs work through GABA. So the ketogenic diet works through many different mechanisms in synergy, and one of them is GABA. So we're sort of interested in it from that perspective. So you can replicate and mimic many of the effects that I'm interested in from a neurological perspective, neuroprotective, with simply administering exogenous ketones to animals, at least, on a standard diet. So this has actually spawned the preclinical animal model data was so compelling that it has inspired, not from our lab, from other investigators, looking at this too, dozens of clinical trials that are ongoing right now. If you just go to clinicaltrials.gov and Google or just type in ketone supplement, I think you get like 30 or 40 clinical trials that are looking at ketone supplements. And just a few years ago, there was none, right? So there's a lot of other people instead of us looking at this idea of, I guess you could call it a ketogenic diet in a drug, but I think of exogenous ketones are calorie-containing molecules that are essentially, in some ways, found in nature. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But they do elevate a bioidentical ketone bodies in the blood and in tissues. So in many ways, they're not so much like a drug, but it's like creatine monohydrate, right? So you can take, creatine is found in meat and is found in other things, and we can take exogenous creatine, and it has not only an effect on skeletal muscle, but on the brain. And I think we're getting an appreciation for creatine as like a nootropic even. So I think I look at ketones as being kind of the next creatine, but it's going to take a while for the research. I think there's like 700 or more trials or studies on creatine, showing the efficacy and the positive effect, whereas maybe there's maybe like 50 to 100 with ketones, but it's expanding very rapidly. So it's very nascent literature, but the nascent literature has spawned many other labs, outside of our lab, and labs that were doing it well before our lab, But I became so interested in this idea that I just changed my whole research direction away from drugs to look at diet and supplements.
If I know
Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, it's fantastic. So much information. You mentioned that, in different contexts, these different types of ketone supplements can have, varying effects or be used for different things. If you're just looking at ketone, beta hydroxybutyrate levels as a endpoint, what would be the difference in taking a ketone ester versus a ketone salt? How long would you see an increase in the beta hydroxybutyrate levels? Is how transient? Is it side effects wise? With these different and the formulations as well. Like there's all kinds of formulations that you see out there.
So you can get an elevation of ketones for 1 hour or 6 to 8 hours, depending on the formulation and depending upon if you took the ketone supplement on an empty stomach or taken it with food, or combined, for example, a ketone ester with a ketone electrolyte salt, right? If you take ketone salts and you combine it with medium chain triglycerides, the fat delays gastric absorption and pushes the pharmacokinetic curve, if you will, to the right. So you get, and this is important, you get a little bit slower elevation of blood ketones, and then you have a significant sustainment of hyperketonemia over time. And the decrease in the spike, so a very rapid spike in ketones, contributes to a release in insulin. So if you consume a ketone ester at a large dose on an empty stomach, you have a very large increase in beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate too, depending on the formulation. And it's that rate of change, the relative rate of change of metabolites, similar to if you have a very rapid, relative spike in leucine, it's going to kick on skeletal muscle protein synthesis. But if it's a gradual spike, maybe it won't kick on the metabolic machinery associated with skeletal muscle protein synthesis. The rapid elevation of ketones can produce a counter-regulatory effect, which is a release in insulin. And then that can shut down your own natural ketone production. So the way to go about doing it is to formulate something that causes a predictable but gradual rise in ketones and sustains that for a period of time and has a predictable decrease over time. So the way to do that simply is to take the way that I do it on a daily basis is beta hydroxybutyrate that's bound to electrolytes, sodium, that has sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium in that formulation. So balanced electrolytes, more or less like the electrolyte supplements that are on the market. So Element is one, I think maybe Liquid IV or Gatorade or even these things. So the higher sodium, but you want to match it with some potassium, calcium, magnesium. And then the electrolytes in and of themselves will actually delay gastric absorption a little bit. So salt does that. And if you combine that with MCT too, that delay it. But ketone salts, the salts can actually delay gastric absorption, so it's not so much of a rapid rise. If you take a beta hydroxybutyrate ester, you have 1,3-butanediol typically is bound to beta hydroxybutyrate. When you consume that, the beta hydroxybutyrate is quickly liberated, so it spikes your glucose or your ketones up very high, but in regards to glucose, actually that comes down pretty low. And you had asked me that question, why does glucose drop so down into hypoglycemic ranges with a single large dose, like 30 to 50 milliliters of like a pure ketone ester, something like that, right? Yeah, so in the beginning, I thought it was insulin, and it is insulin. So the threshold for me, at least, and I measure insulin quite often in response to this, and what I find is that if you take a ketone supplement and it boosts you 1 to 2 millimolar, like a delta, a change, an increase, then the elevation of insulin is almost imperceptible according to like the assays that we're using. But if you were to consume a ketone ester and get up into the 3, 4, and 5 range, then that produces an elevation of insulin equivalent to drinking like 2 to 4 ounces of OJ or like 10 grapes or like a small orange, right? So for me, it goes from like 3 to 6 or 8 or 10, right? Or insulin, my blood insulin levels. And it's equivalent to maybe eating about 30 or 40 grams of protein. So you would get that amount. Whereas if you consume, Keto Start or another exogenous ketone supplement, and you consume it like 10 grams of BHB, pure BHB, and you get that elevation of about 1.5 millimolar.
Is that a full packet of Keto Start?
Keto Start's it's kind of like double, like almost like double dosed in a way. So I usually do half a packet,
right.
and then
which is I'm drinking right now, right?
Yeah. Yep. So consuming a full packet, typically I get about 1.5 millimolar. So I feel the effect, but I've actually consumed 2 packets, and I start to get a bump in insulin, but 1 packet, no. And the bump in insulin is relatively small, probably because the mineral load is delaying, the absorption into the system a little bit. So I think that's really important, because we know like insulin suppression is also important for the anti-seizure effects. So we think that a reduction in glycolysis is therapeutically part of the scenario of the anti-seizure effect of the ketogenic diet, because 2-deoxyglucose has a pretty strong anti-seizure effect, and that is being advocated and used clinically in some studies as the ketogenic diet in a drug. So a glycolytic inhibitor, 2-deoxyglucose. So you consume this drug, and it's like 25 milligrams per kilogram. And if you go higher than that, then it becomes cardiotoxic. So it's not an ideal approach, but it inhibits the glycolytic pathway in a way that sort of mimics effects of the ketogenic diet. And so when we increase insulin stimulates glycolysis. And I think that could be a negative thing in the context of maybe cancer or seizures or other things that we're interested in therapeutically managing. So I view there's the ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones, and they're not mutually exclusive, but I actually think they're synergistically when they're combined together. So if you follow a more liberal version of the ketogenic diet, like a modified Atkins diet or modified ketogenic diet or low glycemic index therapy, which is like a 1-to-1 ketogenic diet, and then supplement ketones on top of that, then I think what you have, in my opinion, is an optimized ketogenic diet for lifestyle, but also, and this needs to be studied and validated in clinical trials, but I think it would also be optimal for epilepsy, for cancer, for managing type 2 diabetes, and also for weight loss. So the ketones have a satiating effect on the brain. So the ketones are alternative energy substrate, and when your brain is metabolizing ketones and it actually experiences low glucose, it doesn't go into an energetic crisis. So it's not signaling that you need to eat. And I think that's really interesting. There have been cases where you could produce a hypoglycemic shock that would be fatal, otherwise fatal. But if your ketones are elevated, you're asymptomatic for hypoglycemia. So that's a remarkable example of the effects of ketones on preserving, maintaining brain energy metabolism. And that has real world effects in the context of everyday living. And if you go on a diet, you inadvertently need to go into a calorie deficit. So calories do matter, for one thing, and you have to achieve and maintain a protracted calorie deficit to lose weight and to some extent sustain that weight for a period of time. Then you can go back to a more eucaloric ketogenic diet or eucaloric diet. But it will necessitate like low glucose, low insulin, and you're going to get hungry. But if your ketones are elevated, that's where ketones shine. They really shine in the context of calorie restriction or an energy deficit, because you have a better fuel flow to the brain in that context, right? So if you're on a low-calorie diet that's producing a state of hypoglycemia, but your ketones are not elevated, that's going to be a painful diet to adhere to and sustain.
Right.
Not fun.
No, and it's funny. Like I absolutely noticed that when I was doing my ketogenic diet, I was doing a lot more intermittent fasting, and it was a lot easier to do. I mean, You do feel satiated. I felt satiated, and this kind of gets into another topic, and I did want to kind of ask you about the difference between, you mentioned the diester for ketone esters, but there's also monoester, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a difference in terms of efficacy? If you're just looking, if you're just kind of wanting to elevate your ketone levels. And again, it seems as though I prefer, like, I've tried all these different types of ketone supplements, and I personally am not a huge fan of the really quick spike, and then like to me it's kind of crashing because my glucose levels get so low.
Yep.
And then when the ketones wear off, it's like, where's my energy? You know?
So you have, hypoglycemia and hypoketonemia, and you might also be kicking yourself out of ketosis. So it could be a dose thing. The 1,3-butanediol beta-hydroxybutyrate monoester that was developed in part by Dr. Richard Veach, and that was one of the first ketone esters that we actually, I became interested in, and it did not have anti-seizure effects. So I didn't lose enthusiasm because I knew there was so many other molecules that could be developed. So we worked on a couple different molecules, and the next one was the diester. Actually, first we had the monoester, 1,3-butanediol acetoacetate monoester had very strong anti-seizure effects. And then we could do more of a trans-esterification reaction. Is just more or less a stoichiometric reaction where you just add more ketones, in this case acetoacetate, to 1,3-butanediol. So it's 1,3-butanediol, which gets metabolized in the liver completely, pretty much, to beta-hydroxybutyrate. That molecule, with a reaction, we can add to acetoacetate molecules. And both of these things, the monoester and the they taste nasty. They taste like gas. But they have very distinctly different effects, at least in the context of the anti-seizure effects. So when we developed the ketone diester, and we used that in our animal model of tonic-clonic seizures, which was, in this case, high-pressure oxygen, but we then tested it in various other seizure models too. It had a very strong anti-seizure neuroprotective effect. And then if we use 1,3-butanediol or any other ketone, it didn't really have that profound anti-seizure effect. So,
GABA? Is there like a difference in the GABA? That?
That's an interesting, theory. But one of the things that kind of stood out was the elevating acetoacetate seemed to be really important. And some of the animal model work, it was brought to my attention by people who had been studying this for longer than me. One of them was Dr. Zhang Ro. He was looking at beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate and saying, there's really good literature with acetoacetate and acetone too having an anti-seizure effect. So the 1,3-butanediol acetoacetate diester elevates beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate more or less in a 1-to-1 ratio. So we did blood work, and we measured blood, and we sent it out to mass spec, and there's there's a quick spike up in acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate from the 1,3-butanediol, and that happens over hours. And we had a 600% increase in the latency to seizure, which means that animals could go 600% longer, and we published that. And then later, we actually combined the ketone ester with MCT and saw a little bit of a boost. The MCT seemed to further elevate ketones and extend the sustainment of ketosis. So that has been the ester that we've focused mostly on in our studies, but at least initially. But then we started tinkering with the ketone salts and putting ketone salts and mixing that with MCT. So ketone salts alone or mixed with MCT seem to have a lot of favorable effects on glycemic regulation, anti-anxiety effects. They also have an anti-seizure effect, maybe not as strong as the ketone esters, which are just more powerful on a per gram basis. But I personally would not, I have access to these things, and I would not want, even if ketone esters tasted great, I would not be consuming them day in and day out. I don't, just for the same reasons, I don't think it's good to spike glucose throughout the day. I don't think it's really favorable to throw a lot of energy in the system in a way, especially if ketones get high, you do get a metabolic acidosis that we see pH drop in our animals. So we measure our pH levels and blood gases and things like that. And we see that the pH level will drop typically when the ketones get above about 3 millimolar. So that's probably not a good thing. So I'm of the opinion personally and experimentally in the idea of keeping exogenous ketones within an elevation of 1 to 3 millimolar, I think is pretty optimal, unless you're managing a very serious form of epilepsy, or you have glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome, or some other inborn error of metabolism where having higher ketones can be favorable because you have a decrease in other metabolic pathways or transporters, like in the case of glucose transporters deficiency.
It sounds like, though, for my own personal anecdote, when I was trying the ketone esters, at first it was like, oh, maybe more is better. I want to get, at least above 3 millimolar. And I got to 3.5 with consuming about 30 mils of, I believe, the 1,3 by that
monoester.
Yeah, that formulation. And like I said, 30 mils, that's a lot. So, there's people that might be doing that every couple of hours even. And it sounds like that could potentially be a dangerous thing to do, especially if they're getting in that range where there could be a pH change. And if they're not measuring it, no one's going to know. So, it's something.
I don't think we know, and I think it's if you have type 2 diabetes, if you have Alzheimer's disease, if you have cancer, I think it's better to spread out the dose too. So I think from my perspective, I'd rather take something that's also delivering electrolytes that my body can use, and also that tastes good. And the 1,3-butane diol is also a consideration, right? Because the liver has to work harder. So it uses the alcohol dehydrogenase pathway. And I noticed, playing around with these things over time, just 1,3-butane diol, which the ketone esters, if I consume that at a certain dose for 2 weeks and then get blood work, my liver enzymes are elevated. They're still within normal range, but they creep up into that upper range of normal, consuming, for example, 1 gram per kilogram per day. But that's the amount that's needed to sustain hyperketonemia, equivalent to a ketogenic diet. So I feel intuitively that it's probably better to take a more natural form of ketones where it's just ionically bound to a monovalent or divalent cation, like electrolytes, which our body tend to deplete anyway when you're on a state of ketosis. So I use the product LMNT, but once we got the ketone formulation kind of figured out, you can deliver the same electrolytes that are bound to ketones. So I think it's a good adjuvant or a good supplement to add to a low-carb diet, to a ketogenic diet.
How often is this a daily electrolyte sort of supplemental thing that's...
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just use maybe a small dose in the morning, and I combine it with creatine, acetyl L-carnitine, and a couple other taurine. There's some supplements that I think are really beneficial with the ketogenic diet. They can help boost ketosis. And then when you're on a ketogenic diet, you're oxidizing so much fat, you tend to be deficient in carnitine. And we see this in kids that are on. So I think carnitine is really important. The selenium, some studies may show up that's really important, but I think that's more of the type of foods that you're consuming.
I mean, a standard multivitamin too also would be...
Yeah, multivitamin, but I think you can get a lot of nutrition from, I tend to eat a lot of eggs and sardines and fish and oysters and things like that are very rich in some things that may be depleted in other people, at least clinically. So I take a little bit of ketone salts in the morning, and then later in the day, midday, as they pick me up, I'll do the other 2/3 of a packet, and I feel it.
Any other supplements that you take or that think are...
Yeah, well, I take, from listening to you a lot, the omega-3s, DHA, EPA, carnitine, because that's really important kind of aspect. If I wasn't taking ketone salts, I would be taking more electrolytes, but I take magnesium. magnesium 3 and 8, and also Biooptimizers makes a magnesium breakthrough product, which is like magnesium in like 5 different forms or 6 different forms. So I've measured my blood levels of magnesium, and it goes up pretty high with that. And I take vitamin D, which was actually low, even though I get tons of sun, and I was supplementing 4,000 to 8,000 IUs a day, and I got a blood test done, and I was on the lower end of normal, which was really confusing. So I got another blood test that confirmed the other blood test that I was on the low end of normal. So I got prescription vitamin D, which is vitamin D2, and but then I ran out of that, and I was using another vitamin D supplement from another maker. I think it was Mind Body Green. And I was supplementing with that, and then got another vitamin D test after, and I stayed elevated in the upper range of normal. So maybe I was using a well-known vitamin D formulation, but it was like from Walgreens or CVS, and I was taking 8,000 IUs a day, and I was still on the low end of normal, even though I'm getting a lot of sun exposure. So this was really probably one of the most weirdest things.
Could have been a polymorphism, or
I was thinking about that.
you know, because there are polymorphisms that some people require, you know, in some cases 2 to 3 times the normal dose to actually just bring you up to like a normal level of like 30 to 40 nanograms per mil. But the other would be that there's been a variety of studies now over the years showing if you just randomly take different vitamin D supplements off the shelves, like Walgreens, you know, grocery stores, that the actual concentration of vitamin D3 in each supplement varies so widely that you'll often get a supplement that says it's, you know, 4,000 IU, but it's more like 400 IU. And it's really a big problem, honestly. So it is good to like kind of find some go-to reliable brands. Maybe third-party sites have tested the concentration of the vitamin D3. I know Labdoor does one, and then Consumer Lab, they actually go around and test the actual concentration of whatever active ingredient, in this case vitamin D3, in a variety of pretty, you know, readily available supplements. So that could have been it as well, right?
It really shocked me because, I mean, we're in Florida, I'm outside, you know, working on the farm, short off a lot, and I double dose I'm pushing like the upper limit, I thought, of vitamin D supplement.
And you have enough magnesium, obviously, because magnesium is important.
I get a ton,
Now, have you done a genetic test?
I did 23andMe, like back in 2010, so I have all the raw data. And I haven't put it into
Run it through our tool because we do a lot of the vitamin D3 SNPs. There's quite a few, and you know, there's several that affect your ability to convert. So there's several steps in vitamin D3 metabolism, but to convert
I've
vitamin
just become
D3
fascinated with vitamin D.
Yeah, vitamin D3 converting it into to 25 hydroxy vitamin D, which is what is the major circulating form, which is what you're getting measured when you're getting a blood test. There's SNPs that affect that. So, and I've had several friends, and I've seen, you know, looked at the data, but I've had several friends that have had to take like up to 30,000 IUs a day because they have the SNP. And
well, D2, and explain to me why prescription is D2.
I don't know why it is.
Okay.
And to be honest,
I asked my doctor, and she didn't know. She was like,
I'm not terribly thrilled. Maybe it's a cost thing because they're getting it from like plant, like mushrooms or something. But I know there's been a couple of studies over the years, and it's really, I don't quite understand like the mechanism, and I don't know if it's known or how much has been studied, but there's some preliminary data, and I haven't checked back, I don't know how much of this has been confirmed, but where vitamin D2, supplementation with vitamin D2 seemed to like inhibit some of the effects of vitamin D in muscle, you know, so I was kind of like, ooh, that's kind of concerning. And I know a lot of vegetarians like to take vitamin D2 because, you know, they want something that's plant-based, but you can actually get vitamin D3 from lichen.
Really?
They produce vitamin D3. Yeah, like stuff that grows on rocks and trees. Yeah.
You can eat it. You can
eat it. Yeah. So there are companies that, like, I know Thorne makes one, a vitamin D3 for vegetarians and stuff from lichen. So, but
in skin-wise, though, if you have more olive skin or so I form keloids. Like this was a big. If I get a cut, I form keloids like African Americans do with dark skin. So I was thinking that there's something, you know, biochemically in my skin, although I don't have like an overproduction of melanin, but I have aspects of of that, of having darker skin, especially like informing keloids. So I'm thinking there's something in my skin, I'm not synthesizing it.
That's interesting.
I mean, I tan if I'm outside. I mean, it's winter now, but usually, I'm usually pretty dark.
Yeah.
But yeah, to have to supplement and double the amount of dose that's recommended, and to be outside all the time and to have low levels. Like, I got the call and said, yeah, we need to get you on a vitamin D supplement. I was like, no, that's not right. Order another, and I got it, and it was like low, like super, like right at the cutoff. But I did take 50,000 IUs of vitamin D2 as a prescription, and 3 or 4 weeks of that, you just take one per week. I was on the upper range of normal, slightly above. Then I stopped, and it went back down to normal, but I was supplementing. I changed to a different brand, and
And you've been able to maintain
the
levels?
Yeah.
What dose do you take?
I think it's like back to 5,000. 5,000 IUs. Yeah.
Maybe it was. Maybe it was the. Yeah. Look at your SNPs. That would be like my first SNP. But then I absolutely could be the actual supplement brand. So. Yeah.
And is there anything acutely or chronically that you could have that would deplete vitamin D? So that was another thing. I researched it, but really couldn't find too much. I figure you would know this.
I mean, there's some evidence that
Stress,
being in a state of like inflammation and like illness, like which you're not.
My HSCRP is like usually non-detectable or 0.1, and everything else, micronutrient status is really good.
Yeah, it's I think it's mostly comes down to the metabolism of it, like forming vitamin, the 25 hydroxy vitamin D3, and then also the brand of supplement. And then there's another thing about doing like a weekly dose versus daily. Again, if you're doing a weekly dose that's really, really high, so if you're doing like 20,000, 50,000 IU a week, you're much less likely to have that huge variation in the concentration of the vitamin D supplement, for some reason, and it seems to be absorbed a little bit better too.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know how much, how negligible that is in terms of what you're experiencing. I would say the SNPs is probably the big elephant in the room. So. Super interesting, but I'm going to get back to We're talking about acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate. I was interested in you kind of already sort of answered some of that question. If there's varying effects of these two, I'm calling them ketones. I think acetoacetate's a ketone technically. Beta hydroxybutirate's a ketone body. You don't really hear that as much, but anti-seizure. So that's one. Acetoacetate seems to really be important for that. Are there any other known
distinct
differences?
Effects?
Two.
There are. Well, we know like beta hydroxybutyrate has epigenetic effects as far as activating, histone deacetylase inhibition, and also there's something called beta hydroxybutyrylation, similar to so beta hydroxybutyrate can directly interact with the histone to cause epigenetic modifications, and it has become the theme of my PhD student's dissertation to look at Kabuki syndrome, which is a rare genetic disease where the ketogenic diet in the lab of Hans Bjornson at Johns Hopkins demonstrated that the ketogenic diet silenced these neurological abnormalities associated with this Kabuki syndrome, which is a rare genetic disorder and causes seizures too. So we want to see if we can recapitulate this with ketone therapy using ketones as an metabolite to alter epigenetic effects in this. So we have those studies going on right now. So there's ketone-induced epigenetic effects specific to beta hydroxybutyrate, maybe acetoacetate, but we don't know. Acetoacetate, on the other hand, has effects, at least in muscular dystrophy, in regards to increasing skeletal muscle regeneration. And it does it through an ERK-MEK cyclin D, I think, mechanism. So it's a very unique mechanism that was kind of new to me, but a pretty good publication came out showing that acetoacetate stimulates. So beta hydroxybutyrate, I was going to go down the path, and acetoacetate too maybe have anti-catabolic effects.
Let's talk about that.
So the research that we've done uses an ester that elevates both of them and shown that it works in a model of cachexia. And we know that acetoacetate has an enhancement, as I said, of proliferation or muscle regeneration, and beta-hydroxybutyrate as a fuel undoubtedly has anti-catabolic effects. And we know that when we administer, even in human studies, if we IV administer beta-hydroxybutyrate, there's a sharp decrease in alanine, and also a preservation of branched-chain amino acids like leucine is elevated, and it prevents a drop. So alanine is like your main gluconeogenic amino acid that is liberated under conditions of stress, high cortisol, high gluconeogenesis, glucagon, things like that. We are going to liberate alanine as a gluconeogenic amino acid. It goes to the liver, we make glucose, and elevating ketones seems to reduce that. And that could play into the anti-catabolic effects.
What are your thoughts on, I'm interested in your thoughts on the anti-catabolic effects of ketones in various contexts of, I guess in human development, or even, with respect to humans that have different lifestyles. So for example, people that are physically active, more young, athletic, versus people that are older and are battling sarcopenia, versus people that are just sedentary. They have different protein requirements, between these groups, but how can ketogenic diets, or perhaps supplementing with ketone supplements, can they have an effect on muscle mass in some way?
I think so, and I think skeletal muscle, and maybe I'm a little bit biased because I've always been super interested in strength training and weightlifting and things like that. But muscle mass is probably the most important factor for healthy aging, and focusing on building as much muscle as possible, I think, is super important, and preserving that muscle with time. So ketogenic diets are probably not optimal for adding as much size and strength as possible, right? But I do think they are important for preserving muscle while improving metabolic parameters like glycemia, hyperinsulinemia, and things like that. So I do think they're the ideal strategy in the context of a calorie deficit to preserve muscle under that sort of condition, right? So, and it does it by a number of different pathways. So I think the elevation of ketones, one of the functions is to prevent muscle loss during periods of fasting, right? So with limited glucose availability or limited food availability, we start liberating fatty acids for fuel, and then the body makes ketones, and then the ketones provide energy flow to the brain, which has very high demands for glucose. So if we didn't produce ketones, we would liberate a lot of alanine and other gluconeogenic amino acids from skeletal muscle, and we would quickly waste away and die. The fact that we're able to make ketones from fatty acids as a water-soluble fat molecule that could cross the blood-brain barrier, that actually becomes our safeguard to catabolic processes that would cause us to waste away, right? So in the context of, and we are sort of wasting away in the context of a weight loss diet, or in the context of intermittent fasting. So then the ketones come into play when we're in a calorie deficit, like I said, but also when we're doing time-restricted feeding. I think the ketones provide an anti-catabolic effect. But from our perspective, we're super interested in ketones preventing age-related sarcopenia, skeletal muscle wasting associated with cancer cachexia. I think that's important. And they're doing it, I think, not only providing, in the context of a disease phenotype or a chronic aging phenotype, the alternative energy function is there, but the anti-inflammatory effects, I think. So with cachexia, for example, you have a high elevation of like IL-1 beta, TNF alpha, which used to be called cachexin, I think, as an inflammatory mediator. So the ketones then work through anti-inflammatory pathways that can mitigate the inflammation-induced muscle wasting associated. So we did a study with lipopolysaccharide, LPS. So LPS causes massive, muscle wasting and sarcopenia with time. And in that model too, the ketones are protective in some ways by inhibiting some of the anti-inflammatory, inhibiting the inflammatory effects of LPS.
Do you think that people that aren't, for example, in a constant state of ketosis because they're on a ketogenic diet, but perhaps they would like to take, a supplement, ketone salt. Do you think that's something that, is it like the chronic elevation or the constant constituent elevation of these ketones that's important, or, are little bumps throughout the day?
It's a good question. So I get that a lot, and I think chronic ketosis is probably not natural or not ideal for most people, unless you're managing a chronic disorder that's responsive to chronic ketosis, like epilepsy and other metabolic disorders. But I'm a big believer in relative changes. So even with intermittent fasting, like I think I'm fasting today. Maybe I just had some ketone supplements, but like yesterday I did. So I only do intermittent fasting probably 2, maybe 3 times a week at the most. Because if I did it every day, I feel that I lose some of the benefits of it. I also lose too much weight. Like I can't get enough calories. I end up eating too many calories at the end of the day. So the body works good. Relative changes are really good to the body. So you get a lot more benefit. I personally get a lot more benefits doing intermittent fasting if I use it more intermittently. Where I feel the benefits a little bit more. So I think the same is true with ketosis, and I think Dr. Walter Longo has a great idea. This idea that I actually gave it a lot of thought, and so it was good to see that he came out with this idea of the fasting mimicking diet being implemented for just a 1 week or 5-day period, right, per month. And that can have long-lasting metabolic benefits even throughout, weeks to even a month or more after you do that, as far as resetting insulin sensitivity and improving different metabolic biomarkers. So I think chronic ketosis is probably not ideal for most situations unless you're trying to get your insulin managed, trying to lose weight and maintain that weight loss over time, and you've had difficulty doing it with other types of diets. But I think there's so many different factors that need to come into play when you're choosing to do a ketogenic diet, including monitoring. People really need to track nutrients, track calories. Some people they eat a ketogenic diet, but they put the same amount of food on the plate, and the caloric density of the ketogenic diet is like 50% higher, so you can't eat. So typically, we have auto-feedback mechanisms that will tell us when we're satiated and full, but for some people, they don't work well. So they do need to count calories and macronutrients and track, at least initially, so they have some idea of how many calories they're eating. I know until I started tracking calories, I had no idea how many calories I was eating. So I thought I was eating more like 3,000, but it was more like 4,000, 4,200 pretty much every day.
I want to talk about these cyclical ketogenic diets, but before we go there, since we're talking about muscle and the anti-catabolic effects of ketones on muscle, I'm also sort of interested in exercise performance as well, like anaerobic exercise versus aerobic exercise. If you are either on a ketogenic diet at that, or doing some sort of modified or cyclical form of it, whatever it is, versus supplementation as well. How being in ketosis affects some aerobic versus anaerobic exercise.
I get asked that question more than any other question, I think. So in animal models, when you put them on a ketogenic diet, and I think one of the first studies we did, published at the Alzheimer's Institute at USF, the bird Alzheimer's, we didn't see a big, robust effect on amyloid beta and tau, but we started the intervention after the pathology kicks in these mouse models, double and triple knockouts. So although I think Dr. Veach and Dr. Mark Madsen, maybe they did ketone ester or started earlier in the ketogenic intervention. So, but in our study, we didn't see any major changes in tau or amyloid, but the mice ran faster. They ran 30% longer and faster on the treadmill, and it was remarkable. And I remember one of the PIs on the project, a very experienced Alzheimer's researcher, was like, "Yeah, we've never seen anything like this." So, so that was an MCT supplemented ketogenic diet, but we've done some research with ketone esters too. So performance, in animal models, we see it. In humans, the data is messy and it's hard to make sense of it. So my general opinion, my speculation is that ketones probably have a small effect on exercise performance in the context of aerobic performance. And in regards to strength performance, my ideas have that about that have been changing over the last couple of weeks because we're giving ketone supplements to some CrossFit athletes and they're breaking PRs. But I think it could be potentially a placebo effect. But since everyone, excluding one person out of dozens of people, I think there's maybe something more. But I think ketones with caffeine, especially ketone salts with caffeine, are a pretty powerful ergogenic aid. So I would loosely say that that's probably a performance-enhancing supplement, the combination of ketones, caffeine, and electrolytes. But I think where ketones shine is using exogenous ketones as a means to preserve performance, resilience in extreme environments. So that's in the context of hyperoxia. So that's what I study. So of course, when you're not having a seizure and your neurological function is maintained and preserved in the context of extreme hyperoxia, like 3 or 4 or 5 atmospheres of oxygen, high pressure oxygen, that's going to be advantageous. But on the other end of the spectrum is hypoxia, right? So a lot of people who are mountain climbing, running, cycling at hypoxia, we know if we put athletes on a treadmill or bike in a hypoxic environment and give them glucose, that the performance-enhancing effects of glucose are not observed in hypoxia, which is kind of, interesting. Whereas it's also shown that there may be an inhibition under hypoxic environments of pyruvate dehydrogenase. So there might be some PDH deficiency or some snag or bottleneck in the metabolic pathway associated with glycolytic energy production under hypoxia. And you would think that hypoxia, chronically it activates like HIF-1 alpha and you have increasing glycolysis and transporters and things like that. But in the context of exercise performance under hypoxia, carbohydrate supplements don't seem to help. Whereas there seems to be, and it was brought to my attention in a couple of reviews and also serving on grant committees and stuff like that, there seems to be a good rationale for the use of ketones for fueling performance in a hypoxic environment. And that could be very strategic and beneficial in like a military setting or like a space, setting or altitude, setting. So my general feeling is that ketones have a small effect at increasing athletic performance. So there's only a few things that actually are powerful ergogenic aids. So we have caffeine, we have creatine, monohydrate, typically. There's other forms of creatine, but beta-alanine kind of works pretty good. So, and a few other odds and ends, but there's just a pretty short list of ergogenic, supplements out there. I do think that with time, as we understand dosing and the application of specific types of ketones in certain settings, that ketones will be added to that list. But I'm not sure it'll be in the top tier list. But I do think it would be in the top tier list under extreme environments.
What about swimmers or surfers?
Yeah, I think being in a state of ketosis could be beneficial from the context of like brain injury, inflammation, and maybe just, the stress of being out, in certain extreme environments, or when we're exercising too, we're overproducing oxygen-free radicals, and these impart an adaptive response to the muscle too, so there could be a benefit to increase oxidative stress. But I think the real benefit of ketones are not, I'm talking about this in the response, and I think your question is in the response to an acute setting. Like consume ketones, go exercise, see what happens.
Or be on a ketogenic diet, yeah.
Yeah. So where I think exogenous ketones will help, and when I was talking that they would be added to the short list of ergogenic aids, is used chronically as an adaptive response. So when we exercise, a lot of bad things happen. If we pull blood, there's inflammation, reactive oxygen speech, things like that. If we use exogenous ketones chronically over time, I think it will help to facilitate the adaptive response to exercise over time. So suppressing inflammation or chronic inflammation, which would sort of enhance or augment adaptive responses to exercise over time. I think there's a good rationale for that, but the science is not there yet. But the science is being done now. So like rodent studies are being done. I'm aware of a couple human clinical trials that are studying this. So,
and what about like doing a maximum effort, like you're doing some kind of sprint, because You do need, if you're going into a state where your mitochondria can't work hard enough to produce energy, you need glucose, right? And if you take one of those big boluses of ketone ester, drop your glucose, what's that going to do for your sprinting?
That's a good point. So one of the criticisms of the ketogenic diet was that it inhibits the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So whenever we're doing carbohydrate restriction, we're limiting glucose availability, but also lowering insulin. And by lowering insulin especially, that inhibits glycolytic enzymes like hexokinase. It also, like the glucose, the transporter for glucose gets internalized into the cell. So you don't, the glycolytic flux is essentially decreased. But I think if you follow a ketogenic diet where you intermittently add small amounts of carbohydrates in, you can keep that PDH from being reduced. So there's, I think I've seen data to indicate that severe carbohydrate restriction could decrease the production and the activity of PDH. This is actually what happens with Alzheimer's disease too. So with Alzheimer's disease, it's pathophysiologically linked to impaired glucose metabolism. So if you do an FDG PET scan, the PET scan shows glucose hypometabolism in the brain scan. So alternative ketones as an alternative energy substrate makes sense. In the context of athletes, you're kind of doing that with chronic ketosis. It decreases the glycolytic pathway, but your muscles and your heart and other tissues actually use fatty acids for a source of energy. The brain, not so much, right? So, and also, when you're on a ketogenic diet, then you're feeding ketones to the brain. So the brain's kind of like a different story. But I do think that it gets overblown. I think, very severe carbohydrate restriction will decrease PDH, and then that will impair exercise performance with maximum exertion, anaerobic. But I think it's really important that if you do a low carbohydrate diet, you have to train under those conditions. You know what I mean? So you can't implement a ketogenic diet or low carb and then train and expect to maintain the same performance. You have to put your body into that state of ketosis and then train very hard to induce those adaptations to make it possible for your body to perform and maintain your performance in the context of insulin suppression and low glucose availability. So those adaptive processes will then come to benefit you come game time or performance time, where you can then titrate the carbohydrates back in small amounts. So this is just called metabolic flexibility, right? So train low when your glucose is low and your insulin's low in a semi-fasted state, and that will induce metabolic adaptations, i.e. metabolic flexibility, that will then benefit you in the context of the actual event, where you can add and titrate carbohydrates back in, or mixed fuels. Really, you want to be able to optimally use glucose, fatty acids, beta hydroxybutyrate, ketone bodies, lactate too, which is an important fuel. One of the things that I used to take when I was mountain biking was Cytomax, which is alpha L polylactate, which is like lactate as an energy. So, and my original interest in academia as a postdoctoral fellow was actually using lactate for brain injury, like stroke and hypoxia. And I was tinkering around with that in a hippocampal brain slice preparation, doing different measurements on that. And somehow I just got steered towards ketones, but I always wanted to revisit the lactate thing because, I think there's a lot that can be done in formulating more of a comprehensive multi-fuel delivery system for the brain. And lactate's been a bit underappreciated and kind of stigmatized and criticized, but I think it's got a lot of potential.
Yeah, really good info, Dom. I've been reading some meta-analyses over the years about training in a fasted state versus fed state, and how, if you eat before, you go for a run or something, that, a lot of the mitochondrial adaptations can be blunted somewhat. And of course, a lot of those studies are using high refined carbohydrate, like some toast with jam, I've always wondered, what, and there is like sort of a cutoff where if you're training in a fasted state for longer than an hour, you're going to have performance drop off, right? Mm-hmm. but I've often wondered, like, if these studies were done using a more modified Atkins diet or some form of a ketogenic diet, those mitochondrial adaptations that are being blunted somewhat with a high refined carbohydrate fuel intake prior to exercise, I'd wondered maybe that wouldn't happen.
Yeah, I think it comes down to like nutrient sensing, right? I mean, it's the whole thing going back to autophagy and and just entering a state of ketosis, that if we're in a state where like AMP kinase is high, like mTOR is low, insulin is low, that whole pathway is low. When you exercise in that state, it may not optimize performance, but it will optimize the adaptations that could serve you later on for performance. And then when it comes time to, you might want to train sort of in a fasted state to induce adaptations and then tinker around with different fuel sources periodically to see if you could further augment your performance. But I think we need to, that's why we need to really periodize our training under certain there's training to force adaptations, and then there's sort of game day nutrition, which is going to be a little bit different than training nutrition if we want to force adaptate, if we want to maximize our performance. So, but one thing you don't want to do is actually radically switch your dietary approach or supplement approach just prior to, you don't want to train for an event and be like, oh, I want to start slamming, MCTs and ketone esters and stuff on game day. No, you want to experiment with it very methodically, before you do that. But I do believe that the health benefits are really important when it comes to exercise, and then not only the health benefits, but I think you're going to get more adaptation in regard to maybe not so much for powerlifting and strength training and things like that, but I think for aerobic performance and just cardiovascular benefits and just actually benefiting at the level of the skeletal muscle and the nervous system too benefits.
So speaking of the nervous system, this is one area where in my opinion, ketogenic diets really shine. And I'm really, what has thoroughly convinced me is, just the overwhelming evidence that you've talked about with the effects on the brain and epilepsy and other types of brain disorders, but also some of the preclinical studies that have come out of our mutual friend, Dr. Eric Verdin, and I know John Ramsey also did some publications where they fed mice, in the case of Dr. Verdin's study, midlife, they started them on a cyclical ketogenic diet, and I'd love to get your thoughts on why. He said the reason they did it was because the mice were overeating, which I found to be interesting because I've always been satiated on a ketogenic diet. But anyways.
A lot of nuance here I can discuss.
Yes, let's get into that. But also the thing that was so striking, and you know much more about the details of these studies than I do, but the effects, I mean, their health span was improved, their median lifespan was improved, so they were dying less earlier, but maximum lifespan, I guess, wasn't affected. But the effects on the brain and cognition, like he said, that the older mice had better cognition than younger mice.
Yep.
And when he said that, I mean, I was like, that's really? So
things are magnified in rodents. So I'll say that as far in especially.
Yes. So my question is, do you think this is going to translate to humans?
Rodent model studies are very, very informative, especially mechanistically, not always predictive. There are some of the nuances is that there's different strains of rodents that will overeat ketogenic diets, and some like early studies before. Some colleagues were feeding it and said, this is not going to work. They're hoarding the food, they're eating, they're getting blown up. This is obesogenic, So the high fat, there's a lot of high fat diet research that detractors of ketogenic diet will point to and say this diet is, causes all these bad things. But that's a westernized obesogenic high fat diet. So what Dr. Verdin used and Ramsey, so they did actually the study that I really wanted to do, and they probably did it better than I could ever do. They have really great molecular tools and everything, and they did it in a very clever way. And I kind of, from my understanding, They did, and the results were to be expected. I think the results are what I would expect. So my understanding is that they did the cyclic ketogenic diet because, they didn't want them to gain weight, which could negate. So I have to look to see what animal model they use. But the C57 black 6 mice will eat a ton of the ketogenic diet food and they don't gain weight. Whereas other, depending upon the strain, and then we have the VMDK mice that we use for our cancer research, and they tend to, it corrects their eating behavior, meaning that if you give them the standard diet, ad libitum, they just gain weight like a couch potato. But a ketogenic diet, they will lose weight and everything improves. So they're like the other end. The C57 black 6 are kind of like athlete mice, I think, where the other models are more like sedentary mice, they're not as active. But what we found, I have to look exactly at the feeding protocol, but when we did a little bit of calorie restriction, our calorie restriction is just putting 5 or 6 grams of food into it every day, and then they eat it within an hour, and then they essentially fast for 23 hours, and then eat it again. So it's kind of more like, but you have to individually house the animals, and then sometimes if you house them together, they'll start like fighting and eating each other because they're kind of hungry. But one thing that we saw very consistently early on is that a mild amount of calorie restriction makes these mice like super mice. Like they become, they're thinking faster. They are really thriving in the context of a calorie deficit. And I think that goes back to human evolution too. So we survive today because we undoubtedly experience food scarcity and limited food availability. And in the context of being hungry, that enhanced our cognition and even exercise performance to be able to acquire resources, right? So the same thing I think is happening in their mice, and it could be, I have to look at the weights of the mice, but a lot of it's kind of like weight dependent and producing that energy deficit. But you just get a whole plethora of things happen in regards to suppressing age-related chronic diseases with just a little bit of dietary restriction. Seems to unmask this. Probably because with a standard rodent chow fed ad libitum, they overeat and it just basically fuels metabolic derangement that contributes to early onset age-related chronic diseases and also the formation of spontaneous tumors. And I think in their studies, maybe it was both, or at least one, maybe both studies showed a suppression of spontaneous tumors too. So this has major implications, I think. We're very interested in actually taking animal models that have inducible tumors, for example, various genes that will kick on at 200 days and then form spontaneous tumors, or a melanoma model where you're subject to UV radiation. And if they're fed a ketogenic diet, can you suppress that? People don't do these studies because the NIH doesn't really fund like cancer prevention research, but I feel like these are the most important studies that need to be done. You put a variety of different rodent strains under different conditions that are known to like induce tumors, and you feed them, a low carb diet or ketogenic diet that you could actually feasibly maintain and do, and you see if you could suppress these spontaneous tumors. But that's what they did in this experiment, and they showed, like you said, an enhancement of cognitive and learning ability. Relative, the older mice learn better than the younger mice.
Yeah,
that we said, yeah.
I know in John Ramsey's in publication, Dr. Verdun mentioned also in the podcast when we had him on a few years ago that they had a time-restricted feeding aspect to it because they were feeding the animals proportions, so very specific proportions. They were only, they were only given their food at when the people, the scientists, were going there into the house and giving the food. So they had this sort of dietary restriction component to it. Whereas Verdun's, they were ad libitum, but they were cyclic. They were going on this cyclic ketogenic diet. And Ramsey's data was more pronounced, like you mentioned. The combination of the dietary restriction plus ketogenic diet seems to be like secret sauce in a way. But to me, it was, and again, like you said, it's the animal. Rodent research isn't necessarily predictive of what's going to be, occurring in humans, but it certainly is promising, in my opinion. And it got me very interested in it. And, I've got neurodegenerative diseases on both sides of my family, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So I'm very interested in, any types of lifestyle. And I also have genetic factors there at play as well.
Yeah.
So I'm certainly very interested in any sort of lifestyle factors that can mitigate that genetic risk, which, as we know, there are many things that you can do in your lifestyle that can help. But doing some sort of modified ketogenic diet, cyclical maybe, because it is, for me, hard to sustainably do it all the time,
That's where intermittent fasting kind of comes in too, because people don't have to tinker around with different. I mean, the foods that we eat are super important, just like eliminating processed sugar, carbs, things like that. That's going to move the needle like quite a bit. But there are some people that I know, like family members, and there are just some people who are not going to count carbs even to do that. There's just not going to happen. But eating within a predetermined time window is pretty easy. That's like a good introduction. And I think once you start doing that, then you start realizing how good you feel in this mild state of ketosis. And then you start, maybe that becomes the entry point to where you start manipulating your food and your macros and things like that.
That's what happened with me, totally.
Yeah.
In that very order. I mean, I practiced a lot of time-restricted eating, and I started to notice in the mornings and stuff, it was like, I'm just so much sharper, and my anxiety was a little bit lower, believe it or not, while I was not eating. And so I decided to experiment with a ketogenic diet. And while I did do it, as you mentioned earlier in this podcast, one of the most pronounced thing I noticed, and this is totally subjective, was my anxiety level was so much lower. Yeah. And I mean, very noticeably, I'm somewhat of I've got some anxiety, that can kind of kick in. And
high performers are like that, though. So that's like pretty much a staple personality. Yeah, sure. And then you leverage that into productivity. Yeah.
But I did. I felt like it was very noticeable for me, and with the anxiety, and then it's like that feeds into, if it's affecting anxiety, what else in the brain is it affecting? Cognition-wise, if you're anxious, it does sort of limit cognition in a way. It can kind of like distract you, and so.
And you did this back like in grad school? You started doing this? I started doing it like before big talks. I would chew on a propranolol and hold it under to get like a beta blocker. I like needed this when I was like in grad school, I think in my and then I realized as I think I got into my postdoc and I started tinkering with intermittent fasting at first and just carb, I was like, wow, this is how I feel, especially when I kind of dieted and brought my weight down a little bit. It's like, wow, I just feel like super calm. It's like I can't even get anxious under certain conditions, so.
Well, I didn't do a ketogenic diet.
Like a nootropic almost too.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I didn't do the ketogenic diet until recent, like this was like last summer. But caloric restriction, I used to do a lot of that combined with exercise as well. So I was kind of like, I was getting in ketosis without, without having to do.
Exercise-induced ketosis.
Yeah, I mean, I was running, this was like even before grad school, but like early in grad school too, I was running like 10 miles a day. And I was doing that like 4 to 5 times a week. So I was running 50 miles. I mean, I was really, I had gone almost to an extreme too, where it was like I had changed my menstrual cycle, where I wasn't getting it, because I was very active, and then I was doing a lot of caloric restriction. I felt great. I mean, I really did. But that was actually a long time ago, and it wasn't until like sort of my time restricted eating when I had Sachin on the podcast back in 2015. I mean, that's when I really got hardcore about trying to like time my timing with my food intake and following that really obsessively for the last what has it been like 6 or 7 years. That's really helped. But the ketogenic diet was also unique, and I do want to sort of incorporate that into I want to do some kind of cyclical version of it. Like I really want to, and I want to measure my biomarkers and all that, which
do them together. So you're still going to do intermittent fasting.
Yeah, and do them together, as well.
That's the key. Like people think it's one or the other or whatever, but low carb intermittent fasting, so just a modified, that probably has, low carb intermittent fasting probably has more benefits than chronic ketosis, eating like throughout the day, I think, for a normal healthy person. And maybe even therapeutically for managing, because I'm communicating with adults that have epilepsy and they're following ketogenic diet, they have breakthrough seizures, but then They take the same diet, same calories, and then do an intermittent, and this is not promoted in the world of epilepsy, but when they take their ketogenic diet where they're having breakthrough seizures and they implement time-restricted feeding, then they get seizure control again. So, and I think the people in the trenches know this, like the neurological teams and dietitians, they realize, hey, well, if you can do this, it's not part of the medical literature, but they know this intuitively just because of the information people are putting out, all the information on intermittent fasting. And, Mark Mattson has been studying this stuff since the 90s, and I first stumbled upon his stuff in grad school, and it always kept his papers with me. I was like showing people, it's like, look at this. Why aren't people looking at this research? It's like so important. I haven't read his book yet, but he has a new book out too. I think, right?
He does.
He inspired me. I think that's how I got inspired into the ketogenic diet. It was looking at the calorie restriction and then fasting, and then that led me to ketones. But it was Mattson actually that actually sparked my fire, and then that led me to some of the ketone researchers.
I asked Mark this question when he was on the podcast, and I'll kind of ask it to you in reverse. And that is, and you've mentioned a little, you've already sort of touched on it, but like, what do you think the overlap between being on a ketogenic diet, a modified ketogenic diet, is with intermittent fasting, whether we're talking about these epigenetic changes with beta-hydroxybutyrate being an epigenetic modulator, a signaling molecule. Autophagy is one that I'm very interested in as well.
Yeah, two things in my mind. Insulin and insulin signaling, like IGF-1, activation of AMP kinase, IGF-1, mTOR, that. But also the ketones as a drug-like mediator on not only alternative energy substrate, but also as a drug-like mediator for all these different things like suppression of inflammation, activating epigenetic effects, and things like BDNF, which I think Mattson's work actually showed that many of the benefits of intermittent fasting were associated with beta-hydroxybutyrate-induced growth factor effects on like BDNF and things like that. So I see there's the hormonal effects of intermittent fasting are replicated with the ketogenic diet, and then the hyperketonemia that's associated with intermittent fasting and the ketogenic diet then have their own effects through beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. So that's two main things, but there's it's pleiotropic, right? So the ketogenic diet, I've given talks to pharmaceutical companies where I go there and they say, well, key in on the mechanisms that we can sort of drugify, right? But the end summary slide is like a dozen or more mechanisms, and there's probably many more, that are all sort of working in synergy. And I think that becomes the reason why the ketogenic diet works when drugs fail, because you have drugs work through GABAergic mechanisms, drugs work through suppressing glutamate. You have a variety of anti-epileptic drugs that work through different pathways, but combinations of them used in high dose often work initially, then they fail, and then patients are put on a ketogenic diet and it works. So the ketogenic diet is working through a mechanism independent of what we know these pharmaceutical drugs are working. And that becomes, the complexity of metabolism is like daunting, right? And to key in on something that's really having, and it could be depending, the etiology of epilepsy is largely unknown. And the ketogenic diet seems to work through all these different types of epilepsy, whether it's like tonic-clonic, there's Dravet syndrome, there's different metabolic, there's absence seizures, and the ketogenic diet seems to work across all these different seizure types, probably because it's working through all these different mechanisms.
What do you think about a ketogenic diet for the treatment of neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease?
I think there are different subtypes of Alzheimer's disease. Again, I think the etiology of Alzheimer's is complex, and there is probably a metabolic phenotype that Dr. Bredesen talks about, like in his book. And I think that phenotype would be very responsive to the ketogenic diet, where you would potentially screen for these patients by doing an FDG PET scan, and if you see, there's like brain atrophy, but if you see a dim PET scan, then a metabolic intervention may be a good, approach for that. But I could tell you just by communicating with hundreds of patients over the years, the ketogenic diet works remarkably well for some patients and has no effect on others, and I don't think it's ever hurt or decreased anyone's cognitive, capacity or anything that I'm aware of. Typically, I get biased feedback, and people are telling me that it's working, but I've seen it not work too. Dr. Mary Newport was one of the people that really inspired me in the beginning. Actually brought her to University of South Florida, and she actually gave a lecture. She used to lecture for some of my classes, and at the time, the early time, she would bring her husband Steve. So I don't know if you know, but there was a case report written on the use of beta-hydroxybutyrate ester as a therapy, and this case report was her husband. And I witnessed that her husband, she had many more years, years, maybe like 5 or 6 years, just from an outsider looking in. It seemed like she had that amount of time extra with her husband to spend because of the ketogenic intervention. And the early part, it was just coconut oil. And then she realized that coconut oil had medium chain triglycerides, and then found the patent by Xera, AC1202. And the active ingredient was caprylic triglycerides. So she went out and bought MCTs and then had an effect, but then learned about the ketone ester and the ketogenic diet and was administering that, and that was helping him. So when 2009, she was a guest speaker in my class, and then we went out to eat, and her husband was shaking with Parkinson's disease-like symptoms. He had Alzheimer's disease. And then he had a vial of MCT and coconut oil. And when he consumed that, within about 15 to 20 minutes, the tremor stopped and he became animated and was commenting on our conversation. So when I saw this in 2009, I realized that he was not really changing. It wasn't the food he was eating. He consumed that supplement. It elevated MCTs in his blood, which can also cross the blood-brain barrier, but produce a state of hyperketonemia. And that acutely stopped the tremors he was having, and he became more animated. And that was being in contact with her and seeing this and witnessing it, and also seeing his clock test and mini mental status exam or state exam, convinced me to go in that direction for my research. So there's no doubt he was a metabolic phenotype, but he was also ApoE4 positive. So which was very interesting, right? Because we talked about, different dietary interventions. So there was no doubt in the study of Xera in AC1202, the ApoE4 phenotypes were the ones that were not responsive to hyperketonemia. But he's ApoE4 and he was responsive, and I saw it with my own eyes. And then that motivated me. Actually, the first study that we did was an Alzheimer's mouse study at the Alzheimer's Center. And then I developed the ketone ester because the funding agency did not want to look at the diet per se, so we focused on the ester later in the seizure studies.
It seems like, in particular with some of these neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's disease, I mean, you mentioned the tremor, that, the standard care of treatment, like carbidopa, there's a lot of terrible side effects with time.
Yep.
And if there was another possible either adjunct treatment or alternative in some way or something, that it should really be explored more. And, like with, for example, if you could, ketogenic diets are so widely accepted now for epilepsy. Like, what about some of these other brain disorders? Is there any movement in research to kind of push to our understanding of whether or not ketosis is going to be beneficial for other types of brain disorders?
Yeah, it's so much easier to do a ketone supplement as opposed to a ketogenic diet. For a randomized, controlled clinical trial is very hard with a ketogenic diet, right? But with a supplement, you can have a control, you can do things. So I think those studies are happening, and we know that, just by virtue of the ketogenic diet altering brain metabolism, brain pharmacology, we know, I observed early on that this is going to be important for many different neurological disorders, and then in cancer too. So that's why we got steered towards, so I didn't want to initially, study cancer, but the data was so compelling that we should at least test this, and it became a whole nother track in my research, that we're doing in the lab. So I think we are, but it's just, it's slower to go in that direction, and we really do need clinical trials before we can start prescribing these things to people, the ketogenic diets or the supplements. And I mean, that's happening now, but there's groups of people getting together. There's a group that I'm involved in that's associated with metabolic psychiatry, and they are looking at dietary interventions for a broad range of psychiatric disorders. And that could be depression, that could be bipolar, that could be even eating disorders like anorexia is under the umbrella of a psychiatric disorder. So there's a lot of potential interventions there. And there's clinical trials, but the data is not there yet to be able to prescribe this for that.
People are out there experimenting with ketogenic diets. They're there's ketone supplements that you can buy on Amazon. I mean, so there's a certain element of there are families out there that are wanting to try different lifestyle changes, dietary changes. Talking to their physician about them is obviously recommended, but I mean they're doing it. They're trying them, and I can tell you so my mother has different types of tremors, essential tremor. She's got orthostatic tremor. She also gets migraines, and she did do the ketogenic diet with me somewhat. She cheated a lot more than I did, but I also have given her ketone supplements, and it's noticeable, and it's the reason why she even was wanting to try the ketogenic diet, because she's very much addicted to refined carbohydrates. But it, noticeably stops her essential tremor and somewhat her orthostatic, which is her legs when she stands still. But noticeably the essential tremor and the migraines. She will, and this is totally anecdotal, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but she will take a ketone supplement, and Esther has worked for her, and ketone salts, so she's done the keto start. And it totally takes away her migraine, which is phenomenal, because I'm not a big fan of the migraine medicine that she wants to take, But she gets migraines that are debilitating. She can't. Oh
yeah, good rationale for migraines. Yeah. So I get a lot of emails about that. I try, because I'm a researcher, I go in the other direction and try not to oversell it as much as I can.
Totally.
Because that's just not very academic. So I get so much feedback, and I'm so excited. I want to cut and paste things and put it on social media about responses, because people will even send blood work or test results or their doctor. But I'm very cautious to do that, because I know the power of placebo. I know the power, but I know what I saw years ago, the stopping of tremors and becoming animated, was not placebo, because the patient at the time didn't really know that what he was taking, really. He was pretty far advanced. But in regards to migraines, the PhD student by the name of, or now Dr. Elena Gross. So we wrote a review together, which kind of highlighted many of the benefits associated with migraines. So she was a person who had crushing migraines and discovered that the ketogenic diet and then later ketone supplements could recapitulate that and actually help to manage her chronic migraines that she had. And it was likely, just like the ketogenic diet for epilepsy is working through multimodal mechanisms. So by probably increase GABAergic tone, increase brain blood flow. Some people get migraines because of an increase in blood flow, and some people because of vasoconstriction. And we know that the ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones increase adenosine. And from our metabolomic data, adenosine, I was not really interested in it at the time, was like many-fold higher relative. It was a thing that was really hot on our metabolomics data. I was like, oh, this is very interesting. So I recognize adenosine as a very powerful vasodilator for cardiovascular, physiology. So when you fast, or even when you go on a ketogenic diet, when you fast, blood flow to the brain can increase by 30%. So it's acute. You can acutely elevate it, and probably through this adenosinergic mechanism. So there's adenosine, there's probably dramatic effects on brain blood flow, on neurotransmitter systems, energy systems, and also neuroinflammation can trigger a seizure. I don't like to go to anecdotal evidence, but I have a lot of people will contact me that have herpes simplex or shingles, or different things where the virus attacks their body, and the first sign that they get is a crushing headache, and then they get full body inflammation, and then they get sores if it's shingles or something like that. And they'll start fasting, or they'll acutely use ketone esters or ketone salts. Actually, they've been using, I've been recommending it, and it's okay, please give me feedback. And I've been giving them recommendations, or not recommendations. I've been suggesting this as a potential way to mitigate the inflammatory cascade, and the feedback has been pretty remarkable that they can basically stop, an episode from, like shingles or herpes simplex. And the same thing happens, they get the crushing headaches, and then usually that's a sign that the virus is starting to shed, and it produces, changes in the brain. Systemic inflammation contributes to neuroinflammation, which contributes to the headache, and then usually you get the cascade kind of after that. So it has worked through a variety of different people, and people get headaches for different reasons. So I think it's kind of like Alzheimer's, where you're going to get, a certain phenotype will be more responsive to it. And I probably should mention that there's products on Amazon that people are using ketone salts where they take it and it gives them a headache. So, and I think I've taken some of these because, I try to test as many things as possible, and there are supplements out there, quite popular ones, where I consume it and then I just get like a headache, almost like a caffeine headache or something like that after that. I think that's a very reliable sign that there's something wrong with that supplement. So if you're getting headaches from supplements, and I've gotten quite a few emails about this, so I know there's listeners out there listening to this, I would say change the ketone supplement that you're taking. So, and it could be the electrolytes, it could be contaminants, purity, potency, tolerability, gut issues. If it disrupts your gut, that could contribute to a headache. So, but I'm firmly of the opinion that ketogenic diet and fasting was also used for headaches. So ketogenic diets, fasting, and exogenous ketones can be used to manage migraines.
The other area that kind of is interesting and leads into the carnivore, because I know we mentioned it earlier, and it is an interest of mine as well, is autoimmune disease. And I know there's been some preliminary evidence. Well, last I checked, maybe there's been more since then, because I haven't done a ton of reading on that. But with ketogenic diets actually helping with autoimmune disease, I know there's been also a lot of work with intermittent fasting mimicking diets, helping with autoimmune disease. And so there, again, might be some overlap with ketosis from either ketogenic diet or fasting, helping with a variety of types of autoimmune disorders. And I know you're not going to say ketogenic diets are going to help with autoimmune disease, but it seems like a promising area to continue to research as well.
Yeah. There's a couple, I was just teaching one of my classes, so there's a couple studies on MS and other, of course, GI-associated autoimmune, disorders. And I'm not an immunologist, and I mean, we do some work, in measuring, immune factors like cytokines and chemokines and things like that. I can say that we know that dietary interventions, nutritional interventions can be powerful modulators of the immune system, and in some cases, a hypersensitive immune system will contribute to increased intestinal permeability. So intestinal hyperreactivity is an immune response, and that intestinal hyperreactivity will always lead to intestinal permeability, which can lead to exacerbating an autoimmune condition. So I think dietary interventions are working through that way too, and maybe suppressing some of the inflammatory mediators, IL-6, IL-1 beta, TNF alpha, things like that. So the ketogenic diet, interesting, can also augment the immune system in ways that makes it hypervigilant in being able to detect things like cancer cells, right? So the ketogenic diet enhances the anti-cancer immunity of people that are following it. Yeah, so a colleague of mine, Dr. Adrian Scheck, did research with a glioblastoma cell line showing enhanced cancer-specific immune regulation, with a dietary intervention. She was also using radiation. And also, I think it needs to be appreciated that there's a lot of people who are against the standard of care, but I think the standard of care in the context of the ketogenic diet is a much more synergistic approach. So when you give radiation, when you give chemotherapy, it's stimulating autophagy and it's stimulating tumor lysis syndrome. So you're actually like breaking down, you have bits of tumor that are entering circulation. And and it's not really talked about, I always think about it in this way. When you give someone chemo, it's killing cancer cells, and then you're stimulating autophagy and tumor lysis syndrome, and then that's stimulating the immune system. So, I think chemotherapy in general is carcinogenic, it's bad, but it's also stimulating the immune system to then attack the cancer cells. In the context of a ketogenic diet, especially if it's calorie restricting, is stimulating cancer, is putting metabolic stress on cancer cells and actually stimulating autophagy sort of in cancer cells, is stimulating cancer cell death. And it makes the tumor more sensitive to chemotherapy and radiation. So you have more tumor die off, and you're also protecting the normal healthy cells. And it's augmenting the immune system in a way that's actually stimulating it more to attack the cancer. So I think, so what I'm saying here is probably, you can't go to any publication, but we just know from tumor biology that, when you kill cancer cells, through any means, you can have this process called tumor lysis syndrome, which could kill the patient if you do it too abruptly, right? But that's why we're very, adamant in advocating a more gradual approach, which would be like ketogenic diets, maybe metabolic drugs, and also hyperbaric oxygen therapy or something that we studied. But it needs to be acknowledged and recognized that chemotherapy and radiation also work by stimulating the immune system, and it works better in the context of a ketogenic diet, which makes the immune system more hypervigilant to be able to recognize and attack the cancer cells. So there's a lot of research being done on that now, and I know the Moffitt Cancer Center, which is by USF, is very interested in immune-based therapies and using ketogenic diets to enhance like PD-L1 inhibitors, like checkpoint inhibitors. There's a paper just came out in a pretty high-impact journal. I forget the name of the journal, but it showed that PD-L1 inhibitors were greatly augmented in the context of a ketogenic diet. And even drugs like metabolic drugs, like the PI3 kinase inhibitors, are remarkably effective and promising, but they have a counter-regulatory effect at increasing insulin. So when we take these things, they can target tumor metabolism, but there's also an increase in insulin. And in the context of insulin suppression with a ketogenic diet, that can unmask and augment and greatly enhance PI3 kinase inhibitors. So Dr. Lou Cantley is really spearheading some of that work. And I think it's, and I've been in contact with a few of the patients in that are doing like really well. And they're using a ketogenic diet to enhance the efficacy of that drug.
And I know gliomas are one type of cancer that seems to be responsive, at least preliminary evidence suggests, right? Yeah,
that was my first interest in keto, because I started doing hyperbaric oxygen, and I saw like cancer cells exploding under hyperbaric oxygen. So this got me very interested in cancer. It was that, and I didn't know why they were exploding. And we had a dye that was looking at superoxide production in the cytosol and also in the mitochondria. So what I would see is that the mitochondria would light up really quick. We were doing optical sections with a laser scanning confocal microscope, and I could see that superoxide production was ramping up like super high and super fast when we hit it with oxygen. And then I would see the mitochondria disappear, and then the cells would rupture. So they're exploding. So we were giving high-pressure oxygen, and the tumor cells were taking that oxygen, and because the cancer cells have defective mitochondria, they put out proportionally more superoxide anion, which then can be converted to hydrogen peroxide and more reactive intermediates like hydroxyl radical, and then that damages membrane lipids, and then you get rupturing of the cells. So I was like seeing this, and I was like, this is very interesting. And what it was telling me is that I didn't know why it was happening, but later found out of the Warburg effect, where you have an altered metabolism. Like some people say the Warburg effect is the cancer cell sort of changing metabolism for its own benefit to redirect nutrients and biomolecules to the biosynthetic anabolic production for the expanding biomass of the tumor. So that's why. And other people, like Warburg, said it was damaged respiration leads to compensatory fermentation, so the sugar cell consumes more glucose. But But it was sort of looking at this effect, which got me very interested in cancer and ways to target sort of cancer cells and then manipulate the substrates. So that actually was the precursor to our cancer work with ketones, because I was using hyperbaric oxygen, and then under different conditions, I started growing cancer cells and feeding them glucose and ketones. And then I would take away the glucose and keep the ketones, and the cancer cells would die. And then I would have glucose, and when I added ketones, it would decrease proliferation. So this is before I ever published anything, but it was like, it got the wheels turning, and I was like, there's something that needs to be studied here. So I had a few different med students replicate each other so they could replicate it. So that gave me some confidence. And then a PhD student came along, Dr. Angela Poff, who's hosting Metabolic Health Summit. So she's now a research associate and does research and among other things. But and then she actually moved this to the animal model, which was ketogenic diet and hyperbaric oxygen, and then later ketone supplementation. And that was a synergistic combination. So the modified ketogenic diet we used was, we took out the lard and we put like a large percentage of the fat, maybe 40% was MCTs, and then we also used omega-3 fats with flaxseed oil. So at the time, I was very interested in MUFAs and PUFAs. So we looked at what ketogenic diet researchers were using, and I was like, well, let's make our own. So we did like 20% instead of like 10%, protein. We did like 20% or more protein, 20 to 25. And then we replaced the fats with essentially MCT, flaxseed oil, and then we put some fiber in there too. And then that became the diet we actually used for the Alzheimer's research, and then we used this diet for our cancer research. And our effects were pretty robust. And I often think, was it because we were using, a diet high in like, omega-3 oils, and we also had higher protein, which I think was a little bit beneficial, but we had high ketones. So we did different diets, and this diet, especially with the MCTs, gave us higher ketones and seemed to work really well.
Wow, super interesting. What about there's different types of cancer, and I know we were discussing this a little bit earlier, the potential for some types of cancer, at least in rodent studies, to, maybe metabolize some ketones and use them in a positive way to benefit the cancer cell?
Yep.
Is that something?
There's no doubt they do. So there's a little bit of, I think cancers are more heterogeneous than we'd sort of like to believe. I think the field at large believes that, and that's why we have all these different cancer therapies. There are some cancers that are very responsive to the ketogenic diet, but when I think of the ketogenic diet as a cancer therapy, I don't think of the hyperketonemia treating the cancer cells. I think of the therapeutic efficacy of the ketogenic diet is through insulin suppression and suppressing the insulin pathway, limiting glucose availability, and also, to some extent, elevating ketones. We know this because if we put exogenous ketones into a standard diet, we can extend the life of animals that have metastatic cancer. So we've published that in the International Journal of Cancer. But what was happening was when you put the ketones in the standard diet food, they probably eat a little bit less, and it's also lowering blood glucose and changing metabolic physiology. But so it may not be. And then the reviewers rightly asked, they said, well, go do a calorie restriction group. So we took a standard diet and calorie restricted at like 25%. And we saw an increase in survival, but it was nowhere near the increase in survival from adding the ketones to the standard diet. So we did that control. So to get back to your question, yeah, I think, brain tumors, aggressive, solid tumors, endometrial cancers, maybe certain GI cancers, maybe lung cancer, are responsive. The cancers that are associated with metabolic derangement are probably responsive. Also, cancers that are more aggressive or more glycolytic, so they're more likely to respond. And brain cancers are a good cancer to study because you get seizures with brain cancers, and because the tools, the treatments are so limited. Like glioblastoma, we just know that standard of care does not work. So you want to use something, a dietary approach can then potentially make the existing drugs work or augment the many different factors that could make the brain cancer more responsive to the tumor. But there are different mutations. There's one for melanoma, BRAF V600E mutation, I believe, which changes the tumor metabolism in a way that can actually maybe cause acetoacetate to be used as fuel. Some cancers may respond to ketones in ways that are different than other cancer cells, like the brain tumor cells that we've studied in the lab. So in particular, there's a melanoma cell line, at least, that has a BRAF V600E mutation, I believe. And those cancer cells have been shown to use acetoacetate as potentially an energy source, but also for biosynthetic reactions. And I suspect there's a variety of different cancer cells that can use ketones not only as a biosynthetic molecule, but maybe even for energy too. But I think largely cancer cells that are more aggressive have reverted back to a glycolytic phenotype where they're primarily relying on fermentable fuels, and that includes glucose and glutamine are the two fuels. And cancer cells that are more glycolytic and very sort of damaged in their respiration due to the hypoxia of the expanding tumor mass. So as a tumor grows, it outstrips its ability to supply blood flow and oxygen to the tumor, so it becomes hypoxic, and that further damages the mitochondria. So it causes the tumor to be more glycolytic and less of the oxidative phosphorylation pathway. So literally this would mean that tumor cells, especially the core of an expanding tumor biomass, would not be able to use ketones as an energy source because it's a mitochondrial energy event. So in that way, we think that ketones are not an ideal fuel for tumors. And in our model systems, it's very clear that they cannot run in the absence of glucose. Tumor cells die, whereas even in the presence of consistent glucose, when we add ketones, there seems to be a decrease in proliferation, and we think that could be due to a ketone-induced decrease in hexokinase, which is a glycolytic enzyme. So there's a lot of potential, I think, for using ketogenic diets as an adjuvant therapy, and then maybe some potential as using exogenous ketones as a means to influence the tumor microenvironment and also to influence essentially the metabolism of the tumor as a whole.
And also, as you mentioned earlier, with Dr. Eric Burden and John Ramsey's co-published studies, there was a reduction, and there's a possible preventative, mechanism as well. With, at least according to animal research, there being a reduction in spontaneous tumors in these rodents. Seems promising to study, as well. If there's any way we can reduce cancer incidence, it's always easier to not get cancer than to try to treat it. So,
exactly. Yeah.
So that's also really a sort of interesting and promising field that.
And I think, those results were impressive. So suppressing tumor growth through probably IGF-1 and mTOR, and just keeping inflammation low, and many other, biomarkers, I think it's optimizing to do that. But if we take these ketogenic diets and optimize it with specific phytonutrients, and we add some fiber in, and we add, then it becomes difficult to figure out what's doing what. But I do feel that there's some synergy in optimizing a ketogenic diet with plant, fiber and phytonutrients that we know have anti-carcinogenic effects, like curcumin and turmeric and EGCG. And there's groups at the Cancer Institute that spend their whole life studying just a handful of these phytonutrients, and they show that it has remarkable chemoprevention effects. So we should be incorporating these into the ketogenic diet.
Which brings us to the all-meat, carbohydrate diet, real briefly. The carnivore diet. There's a lot of people that sort of feel like they've done a ketogenic diet and they need to graduate somehow to another level of zero carb. And what are your thoughts on,
Well, I'm not sure if it's like, I think it's going back towards kindergarten. So I do think there's no doubt that a carnivore diet is beneficial for some people. And I think it's therapeutic in some ways. It is a form of a ketogenic diet. I followed it, actually felt pretty good on it subjectively, but objectively, my biomarkers my LDL, I think, was doubled on it. And then my triglycerides started to creep up. So this was a little bit of a concern for me. Like if you have the fat pathways were a little bit backed up. For example, if you have an inborn error metabolism like carnitine deficiency, either primary or secondary, a telltale sign is like an elevation of triglycerides, hypoketonemia, and then you have a lot of a cascade of different things. Like you're just not metabolizing fat as well as you should be. Whereas we know that certain omega-3 fatty acids can actually increase the carnitine transferase and actually augment fat oxidation. Certain fatty acids can. For me personally, I felt good. I felt fine, but my blood work was a little bit concerning. And when I went back to just adding more fish and omega-3 fats and more plants back into my diet, maybe it was a fiber, maybe it was phytonutrients, I felt just as good, but I brought my biomarkers, especially my triglycerides, came back down again. So, but I think it depends on the type of meat that you're eating, the amount of food that you're eating. If you're eating the carnivore diet and creating a calorie deficit while you're doing it, I think it could be beneficial. But I don't think it's something that would be sustainable or optimal long term. So it could be sustainable. It is for a number of people that I know. But I guess the question is it optimal? And I have no science. I'm not aware of any science that supports a carnivore diet is optimal for treating anything. Although I've been in communication with people who have benefited greatly from it. So I'm not going to criticize it too harshly. Yeah, it is a form of a ketogenic diet.
Yeah. I mean, it's so, again, as you mentioned, it's like, well, are these people severely caloric restricting themselves? Are they just getting off of a terrible diet that's,
yes.
I mean, there's so many factors. And again, it's like, well, it's
and the lack of fiber.
The lack of fiber and, the phytonutrients,
which kind of brings it back to the fiber issue too, right? Because it's obvious that we could do well off no fiber at all. So the question is is fiber necessary? I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's optimal. So I think excluding it altogether is not doing our bodies any favor. And I think when we add it back in, there's just so much good data on fiber that it's hard to ignore. So that's why,
What do you think the colonocytes and getting the butyrate from fiber, what do you think is happening in the gut in someone with a no fiber diet? The butyrate is so incredibly important for gut health.
It is, yeah, and it's a primary fuel for colonocytes. So I don't know, but I do know that if it caused a massive disruption of the gut microbiome and intestinal permeability, it would show up on blood work as HSCRP elevation. Mine trended, it actually went up from 0.1 to 0.2 or 0.3, but that's not, so I think humans are omnivores and they're incredibly adaptable to any kind of diet. So, and I think that dietary diversity might be a good thing, but you have, populations of people in Africa or other areas where they just eat one food all the time, and it could be some cornmeal or it could be whale blubber in another, and they do perfectly well, they survive, they live a healthy life. So it's just staggeringly remarkable that we have the metabolic flexibility and adaptation to eat almost anything. The question is, what is optimal? Should we even be eating such a huge diversity of things? And I think that could be beneficial. At least, it gives us an array of different things that we can eat, and we're grabbing nutrients from different areas. But yeah, I am kind of a little bit neutral on the carnivore diet. I think it's beneficial for some, but I think it's suboptimal as a ketogenic diet.
And as you mentioned, there's just a lack of empirical evidence? Like there's anecdotal
Now,
evidence,
yeah,
which again
yeah,
is confounded all the time by many things. But
yeah,
there's really not a lot of research that have been
yeah.
done on I mean, published and peer reviewed
But
and, actual,
yeah,
you know,
but there are people doing it and they're thriving on it,
that's
and
true.
they've corrected, various everything from autoimmune disorders. There's super high achievers. You have Sean Baker, who's just like a physical specimen, and he's just eating nothing but meat and doing very well, and has, I don't know, I haven't seen his blood work, but I think it's okay. I mean, he's smart enough. But I do think that if you're eating a carnivore diet and you're getting surplus amount of calories, which I kind of did because I added just a few pounds, and I think that negatively affected a lot of my blood work. But if you eat a carnivore diet in a calorie deficit, then I think it could be therapeutic and potentially helpful. So it all comes down to calories. People ask me if calories matter. I think they most certainly do, and I think we need to appreciate that, because a lot of the ketogenic diet community, they say don't count calories, just count carbs, or calories don't matter if you eat this way, but calories absolutely matter.
You mentioned having you do intermittent fasting sort of cyclically, and is it like how many times a week or how many meals a day? Like, is it something that you alternate each week?
My normal pattern is to have like a small ketogenic breakfast and then more or less fast through midday. I'll have like a ketone supplement or maybe a small coffee, but not past 2 o'clock. And then I eat dinner typically between like 5 and 6. Probably try not to do a little bit later if I'm working late. Sometimes it's later. But I consume the most of like 80% of my calories between 6 and 9 p.m. I know 9 sounds kind of late, but we go to bed around 11 o'clock. But I get the bulk of my calories probably with dinner, which is around like 6-ish, 5 or 6-ish. So, and a lot of my protein too. But in the morning, I eat a ketogenic breakfast. Lately, I've been eating waffles and making waffles. There's different ketogenic waffle recipes that are really, really good. So I've been experimenting in the kitchen a bit with my wife.
What about your exercise routine?
Yeah, I try to do some form of exercise every day. I mean, we live on a farm, so farm work occupies probably about 10 to 20 hours a week of my time and that's good outdoor activity, getting sun, exercise around the cows. We walk our dogs, usually like twice a day, and then I do resistance training no less than twice a week, but sometimes I try to get 4 times a week if I can. And then I like to do a lot of body weight exercises. And I think when you're traveling and you're pretty busy, like chin-ups, push-ups, dips, a lot of chin-ups are probably like one of my favorite exercises, pull-ups, chin-ups. Yeah.
And then you're doing some hot tub therapy.
Hot tub therapy,
Heat
yeah.
stress.
So the benefits, so your article on sauna and just hyperthermia in general. So I did some experiments measuring my core temperature and showed that getting the hot tub to about 105 to 110, I could get my body temperature up to about 102 within about 15 minutes. And I really believe in looking at the literature. And also after I do this, I then measure, I've measured my glucose and my blood pressure comes down, and it seems to be, my blood pressure is like the lowest it's ever been. It's like 97/60 or something, or 58
Wow.
or something. It's really low. And I always trended on the higher end of systolic, especially like 130, 140. I think during grad school it was like 145 consistently, systolic pressure. Always ran a little bit higher systolic, although I carried more mass at the time. But the one thing that has really moved the needle on my blood pressure has been not changing anything and just doing what I'll call heat therapy with the hot tub.
That's awesome.
Brought it down 5 to 10%. And I was like measuring like 5 times a day blood pressure throughout the day because I would love to have a continuous blood pressure monitor. That would be really cool. But my continuous glucose monitor with the Levels Health app is very insightful and gives information, and I can do like a comparison of this meal versus that meal, and sauna versus cold. I can mark it and time mark it and do a CGM comparison.
What's the best way to measure your actual ketones? Is it blood, breath?
Good question. Yeah.
Best versus also most like easy for people as well. I mean, they're both kind of important.
Again, like people don't like this, but it depends. So that's my answer to a lot of things. So it's context dependent. The The clinicians that are managing epilepsy patients say that urine is great and they're not going to change from urine. And they're doing, because they don't want to prick the kid's finger too, right? So I did blood. I like using the glucose ketone index.
What is that?
It's your glucose over ketones in millimolar concentration. So if you're fasting, it takes me about 72 days, 72 hours to get, although the guy fasted for 360 or 80 days, fasting for 72 hours gets my glucose ketone index to 1, where my glucose comes down to about 3 millimolar and my ketones come up to 3 millimolar. So that would be a glucose ketone index of 1. And it's my belief, although I haven't measured LC3 and other components of the autophagosome, it's my belief that achieving and sustaining a glucose ketone index of 1 for 24 hours will induce and perhaps maximize autophagy. No doubt that you can get more benefits 5-7 days, but then at 5 days and 7 days, I see a suppression in testosterone and other things I don't like. So for me, 3 days is like the sweet spot. I can achieve a glucose ketone index of 1, and then my breath acetone is off the charts. And I think breath acetone is probably your best ketone to measure if you want to lose fat. So all the carbons of the acetone you're blowing off essentially are from fat. So when you look at the device and it's reading like 40, it's like, ooh, you're just like basically exhaling fat carbons. So from that. So I think breath acetone is great because with beta-hydroxybutyrate, I could be at 2 or 3 millimolar and just walk around the house or do some activity, and then I'm back down to like below 1. That's because your body's using the beta-hydroxybutyrate as fuel, and if you have a calorie deficit, you have high tissue uptake of beta-hydroxybutyrate, right? Whereas my breath acetone seems to be more stable and a better correlate of fat oxidation. So, and it's also easier. So if you're blowing into a breath acetone meter 5 times a day, that's a lot of money in strips and a lot of poking your finger. So I use the Readout Health Biosense device. And I don't know, I've blowed into mine like 1,000 times, and that would be cost prohibitive from a ketone monitoring perspective, and a lot of finger pricks associated with that. And it has a pretty cool app and also a fasting sort of meter in with it. I think they collaborate with Zero Fasting, so I think there's some collaboration there, but it can show you if you're doing a fasting and using that. Although it's more of a clinical device, but it's broken into more mainstream, so it's an FDA-approved class 1 or whatever physical device, medical device for measuring ketones. And I became interested in acetone because it correlates with seizure control. So acetone does. So I recommend it to parents who have kids that are managing and they don't want their fingers pricked, and the urine ketone strips are not very accurate. So to answer your question, I think both blood ketone measurements, if you're just starting the ketogenic diet, it may be good to just use urine to say, yes, you're in ketosis, you're not. It's like semi-quantitative, and then spend the money to get a ketone meter, like the Keto Mojo device is probably one of the best. And then a breath acetone meter is good for people who are doing fasting and for people that are really interested in like weight loss.
What about using blood glucose levels like as a proxy? Like, is there?
That's like super interesting. Yeah, we had an NIH workshop sort of on this, and I brought this up as a continuous ketone monitoring or continuous glucose monitoring system. And now you have the ketone monitoring system with Abbott. It has a Lingo device now, which does like glucose, ketones, lactate, and also alcohol. But a CGM device is like the ultimate device to look at dietary adherence to a ketogenic diet, because the trace should be completely flat. And if there's big excursions, then that person's not on a ketogenic diet. I guess if they're under stress or they're exercising really hard, you might get a blip. But generally speaking, like a CGM trace is a very, very good way to tell if someone is adhering to a ketogenic diet. So these things should be used. I think generally speaking, the community also feels that this needs to be used, but it's an off-label use.
Is there like a level that's like a range, or does it vary? Like, if you were to give an guesstimate
of what the
blood glucose level, like to like
For a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, to say like I'm probably in ketosis because my blood
Yep.
glucose levels are X.
Yeah, well, I could show you on my So what was very interesting, when I woke up this morning, I spiked 40 milligrams per deciliter. I've never seen that before, like ever. And so my CGM trace typically looks like, probably now it's going to be, maybe I'm excited, and maybe it's all over the place, but it's going to look like, so I set it to, I added like an extra 30 so it wouldn't go off negative during everything. But right now, if you subtract 30 from that number, that's what your CGM trace should look like on a ketogenic diet. And you've worn a CGM
I need to
before,
get
so I'm 74. Yeah. So, but when I woke up this morning, it's not. I had I only had maybe like 4.5 hours sleep or something. So it could be that. It could be the different time zone or something.
Oh yeah,
like
totally.
that.
That's it. I mean, that was the first thing I learned from my CGM was because I started wearing it when my son was like 4 or 5 months old. Mm-hmm. So I was really like, I was waking up multiple times to breastfeed, and so my sleep was insanely disrupted and fragmented, and my blood glucose was just out. It was just going out of control, and it was always on the nights when I was like waking up multiple times and not getting enough sleep. And that was like one of the biggest things I learned from my CGM. That was surprising to me.
Where were your highs? Like how high were your highs? So mine spiked to almost like 130 or 140, and that's unheard of. Like I've never seen that, but that just could be due to the time change and getting about half of the normal sleep that I get.
I
mean, I feel fine now, but okay, yeah.
It's been too many years,
it was
but
just highly variable.
It was something like that. It was above 120. Where it was like, this is postprandial level, like this is pretty, like intense, a robust effect. High intensity training. I was doing a lot of spin class and stuff, like hour-long, pretty intense spin. That would help. Like, so if I do the spin and then have the disruption that night after the spin, it was way better. Like my glucose was way better. So like the exercise totally helped negate some of the glucose dysregulation that I was having. I don't know what exactly was happening, but my glucose spiking so high. So so that was also a learning. I learned so much from the CGM, and I haven't worn it for a couple of months because I have to I think I'm going to do levels because my prescription's like expired.
Levels is great.
Now I'm like, okay, I think I'm going to move to levels.
So I'm not going to mention the other, but I did a couple different companies and I just wore it. But levels, well, they're in beta now, but the difference about levels is that it's kind of coaching you, and you also have the option to, I mean, you could just push and get to a nutritionist. So I guess that's good for people, maybe not like us, but for the average everybody. But it has so many features built in. Where I exercise, it'll say, what did you do here? We saw that you exercised. So it learns my body. Even if I have a cup of coffee in the morning, it learns my sort of dawn effect. And I just take a picture of my food, it event marks it, and then it sends me an email the next day of the picture of my food, my average glucose effect, my metabolic score, and things like that. So it's so easy. Otherwise, I mean, you could just buy a CGM, I guess, if you had someone prescribe it to you, and just look at the CGM trace and then make your own inference. But I kind of like having, as long as I engage with the app and I take a picture of my food and everything, I get the email the next day, and that tells me what happened to my glycemic response the whole day. And it also gives me a weekly thing. So all I have to do is just engage with the app once a day, and it sends me like a daily report and also a weekly report where I could see like every day. And there's so many features. I don't even use like 90% of the features, but I use like 10% of the features, and it's very useful to me. And I think, so we're doing a clinical trial right now with CGM. And people have app fatigue. Not everybody wants to be on an app all day, but you can engage with it as much as you want, or just, engage with it 2 or 3 minutes per day is enough to really be getting a lot of insight into your own metabolism. So.
I found just wearing the CGM without even having to do all the app stuff really helped me figure out what foods that I should be eating and portion sizes and all that stuff, because it was like,
what were your biggest surprises?
The spinach, the cooked spinach was the one because I was
yep.
like, oh, the sugar and it has a low glycemic, you know.
Yeah.
But what you said makes a lot of sense. I think that was a big surprise. And then another really big surprise was like a lot of these like cauliflower rice. You know, like I was traveling on part of this, you know, where I was on the ketogenic diet, and so I would like order food that was like, this is keto, and you get something in the store and this is keto, and I'm like, this is not keto at all. I'm like, it's like spiking me so high, and then you like track down the ingredients and it's like sugar, and I'm like, really? You're calling this keto, but you actually have added sugar in it. Other surprises where I was taking some like collagen gummy chewables that didn't have any sugar allegedly, and my blood glucose just went through the roof, and I'm like, what's in this? Something.
Same thing. I tried some kind of sugar-free gummy. It shot me off the chart.
Yeah.
And all the bars that I get sent. So
anything
90% of it. The only bar has completely ketogenic is Keto Brick. So it's like the brick is 90 grams of fat, and I think 20, like maybe 30 grams of protein, and like hardly any carbohydrates, and it's 1,000 calorie brick, and that's like truly the only ketogenic, you know, bar. There's a bunch of bars out there. Keto Brick, check them out.
I mean, if you go to Costco now, it's like
oh, I know, everywhere,
like keto ubiquitous. Everything, and it's. I haven't yet to find actually something when you turn around the back and you look at the sugars and the ingredients that like one of these things that was like there was like this coconut keto crunch, and my mom loves coconut, and she was doing keto, and like ordered it on Instacart, and then I came and I'm like, there's a lot of sugar in this. This is not keto. Like, and how dare they call it keto? It's so misleading. Again, takes us back to the beginning where it's like this keto has become, it's very much become trendy, and it's almost like this marketable thing. And you know, I think the essence of ketosis has been lost somewhat. So it's really been nice having you to talk about all this. I want to talk even longer, but we probably should wrap this up. Thank you so much, Dom. We're gonna have dinner tonight and talk more, so that'll be great. I want to talk to you about all sorts of things. But like for people that want to learn more about your research, they want to follow you, they want to learn about Metabolic Health Summit or your blogs, all those things. Where's the best places to find you on social and all those?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Ketonutrition.org. So ketonutrition.org, and we have a blog there. Subscribe to the newsletter. When this podcast comes out, we'll put it in the newsletter, of course, and a lot of other information that I don't post anywhere else is in the newsletter, as you do too. So subscribe to your newsletter, which I did, and it's like an awesome source of information. Metabolic Health Summit, which will be happening May 5th through the 8th. Amazing event. We have clinicians, basic scientists and entrepreneurs scrambling to this area, and influencers. It's an amazing event in Santa Barbara, California. I'm excited to be a co-host for that. And most of the information that we promote will be on our blog and on our website. I personally do not have any products. People always ask me, Dom, what's your ketone product? I don't have a ketone product, but I do support a number of different companies, and it's on the website. The exogenous ketone product that I use is Keto Start. Keto Brick is my go-to keto bar. I get that question asked all the time. And Keto Brains is a coffee creamer that I use. It's got alpha GPC, theanine, it's got lion's mane in it. It's also got C8. So these are 3 supplements that I use pretty much on a daily basis. Not a huge supplement guy, but these are supplements we love and promote on that website.
And you're also on Twitter?
On Twitter, if you search my name, I always forget my Twitter handle, but on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, I like to share new literature that's out, our publications and others in this space. So I try to be a resource, not as much as you, but we should put out amazing information, and truly appreciate you giving me this platform to give my information to your followers. Appreciate
my pleasure. Thank you for all your research, Dom. I'm looking forward to more and to a future conversation. So.
Thank you.